so that we can start. Thank you very much for being here on time. As we are starting with the second part of our agenda of today, which is a joint ETUC and EESC or EESC ETUC seminar on a very important issue, which is European industrial policy for quality jobs. I'm really happy that we were able and managed to do it jointly with the ETUC. You know that we are, and we've talked about it, a while ago, how important it is to join forces in the issues that are really extremely important for both of our constituencies. Esther, let's start, then I continue.
Thanks so much, Lucy, and congratulations. Really happy that we're going to be able to continue to work together, because this is the moment when we need to come together to join forces, and no more important topic than winning a European industrial deal, because we need more than words. I was attending a union meeting recently, and the union officials said to me, Esther, don't say just transition. And the reason she said that to me was because workers are losing faith in the promise of a just transition. But instead, I went in and I argued for a just transition, because we won the idea of a just transition. Now we've got to win the reality of the just transition. So that's what this discussion is all about. How do we win the reality of a just transition? And before she speaks, I'm just going to say I'm so excited to hear the ideas that are going to be put forward by Professor Mazzucato, because one of the big questions is, how do we make sure that the errors of the past, where we put forward the idea of an investment programme, companies got money, but workers weren't protected and taxes were not secured from the profits that were made there. So what's absolutely essential is that we don't make those errors of the past, that what we make sure to do is to have social conditionalities, collective bargaining, anticipation and management of change firmly bolted into those investments. So really looking forward to the discussion and debate. And Lucy, thanks so much for doing this jointly with us.
Thank you very much, Esther. I will just shortly frame. Ludovic is here. Yeah, brilliant. Shortly frame today's debate. You know that we are having a keynote speaker, which comes just immediately after my introduction. Then we are having a panel discussion, and in the afternoon we are starting with a video message of Teresa Ribera. We are very much happy for that. And another panel discussion to go deeper into the different aspects and issues of today's seminar. It's for me a real pleasure to be able to open this joint seminar together with the ETUC on European industrial policy for quality jobs. We all know, and we already debated it briefly this morning, that this is a really pivotal moment. Our colleagues are facing really uncertainties, job at risks, wages under pressure, rights under attack. Governments and businesses talk about competitiveness, sovereignty and security, but too often they forget on one fundamental fact. Without strong workers, there is no strong industry. Without quality jobs, there is no sustainable future for Europe. Europe was the birthplace of industrial progress. But let's be honest, those early industrial revolutions came at a devastating human cost. It was workers who had to fight for fair wages, safe working conditions, and fundamental rights. And what about now? We are now standing at another turning point. The twin transition of digitalization and decarbonisation are reshaping our economies. But let's be clear, there is no just transition if workers are the ones paying the price. The world is shifting. The return of protectionism, aggressive trade policies, and the rise of far-right narrative threaten the European project as such. We cannot ignore that Donald Trump's America First policies or China's industrial dominance will impact European industries. But our response cannot be just resistance or criticism. We must build a strong, independent and sustainable European industrial strategy. A key part of this will be the upcoming Clean Industrial Deal. This initiative presents both challenges and opportunities, and we must ensure that its implementation is worker-centred. To be truly effective and fair, a European industrial policy must prioritise workers' rights and quality jobs, avoid a trade war, drive a fair green transition, and develop strong digital industrial policies, investing in AI, cloud computing and semiconductors. Today, in our first panel, we will begin by discussing our vision for a European industrial policy, one that puts workers at the centre of industrial transformation. Professor Mariana Mazzucato, Professor in the Economics and Innovation and Public Value at University College London, will deliver a keynote speech, and we will then continue with the second panel, hearing from European Commission's Executive Vice President Teresa Ribera, who will introduce the Clean Industrial Deal. And this will be followed by a discussion on the key components that should be included in this strategy. So without any further delay, I would like to pass the floor to Professor Mazzucato for her keynote speech. Professor, I would like to ask you to limit to some 15 minutes so that we have time and chance to exchange, to hear comments, and also for your responses. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor for me to be able to address you because I think there's an urgent need for the discussion you're having today. Let me just first make sure you can hear me and see me. Is everything okay?
All is fine. Continue, please.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. So I really like how you have actually contextualized the situation, which is that the concept of the just transition is incredibly important, but unless we admit that it has to be fought for, it needs to be negotiated, and it does not come down from heaven, then it will not happen. And I don't think this is currently happening. If we look at what's happening both in Europe with the next gen EU recovery plan, it's not clear whether when that actually comes into the member states, the degree to which the co-creation, the collective investment that is done with those funds is done in such a way that actually puts people and planet and labor at the center. If it does happen, it happens usually because there's something specific to the country in terms of the type of capitalism. We know, for example, that workers are on the board, trade unions are on the board of some companies in Germany. This is not the case in Italy. So we should not really assume there's a European strategy. There's European funds, but when they come down to the country level, how it gets negotiated, how it gets directed, and who wins, how it's distributed to make sure we socialize not just the risks of the investments, but also the rewards, depends on the type of capitalism we have on the ground. And the reason that I think this is such an important discussion is that the global context is extremely worrying. And this actually was very worrying before Trump. Now it's even more worrying. And what I mean is that the labor share of global income has been globally declining. We know that GDP is not a perfect measure of growth, but actually you can use it to look at the share of wages, of profits, of interest and rents. And we know that if you do that, you see that the labor share has been falling. And this is not because capital has become more innovative, more entrepreneurial, so on and so forth. It's actually because there's been a huge capture of that income by capital. And we need to put this at the forefront of when we talk about the just transition. If the share had remained at the same level as in 2004, the labor share of global income, that income would be larger today by $2.4 trillion, just in 2024 alone. And this is really also about corporate governance. We can talk about investment, we can talk about industrial strategy, but unless this actually goes to the core of how we govern our companies how we govern our public institutions and how we govern their relationship, then things will not change. And I always go back to the point that markets and business are not the same thing. The market is an outcome of how we govern business, how we govern public institutions, how we govern labor unions and civil society institutions and their interrelationship. And a key problem today on corporate governance is that the profits that are being created by a huge collective effort, labor being the first, right? Because without workers, we would not have economies. Those profits are not actually being reinvested back into the economy. We have had over 7 trillion, that's 12 zeros, $7 trillion being used just to buy back shares, stocks in the world, to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. Let's remember that most executives and senior managers get paid with stock options. And that also means that the tax that they are paying on that is capital gains tax, which in many countries not only is very low, but it's also, incentivizing short-term trades, because the time period that you need to be investing your money in order to get a capital gains tax reduction is often way too short. And by the way, in the United Kingdom, where I live, it was actually the Labour Party under Gordon Brown that reduced the time that private equity had to be invested to get a capital gains tax reduction from 10 years to 2 years, making it even more short-termist. So this problem of short-term finance, making millisecond trades and earning trillions. If we look at the trillions in profits globally, this is mainly from the financial sector, and the business sector has itself become financialized. And again, what I mean by that is that the profits are not getting reinvested back in. Of course, once they get reinvested back in, we want them to be steering the economy to become more sustainable and more inclusive. But this problem of the lack of reinvestment, even just that first order principle of the reinvestment, let alone the sustainability, is a huge issue. And around 5% of employment in the EU continues to be in highly polluting industries who will likely, obviously, need to transition. But how that transition occurs, of course, requires both public funding to retrain workers and so on, but also the businesses themselves should be doing that. This isn't just about, publicly funded training programs, as important as they are. And we should also remember that union density is typically much higher in traditional industrial and manufacturing sectors than in services, but services employ a huge number of workers in the EU. So those services themselves also need to transition if we want a green transition. And we should remember that, in some countries we have financial services that are not actually helping the real economy transition, but they could. There's no reason that they shouldn't. In Denmark, for example, it's the country that it's the #1 provider of high-tech green digital services to China. And if you look at where those digital services came from, the green digital services, it was actually from very ambitious city-level policies where Copenhagen, for example, wanted to be the greenest city in the world, and they used their demand-side policies, like through procurement, to allow small companies to scale, producing the kinds of digital services the city needed, but also working closely with Vestas, a very large national champion in renewable energy. And I just mention that because we should remember this is about both manufacturing and services. But if we don't have an ambition on the green economy, then we have this mismatch between the finance sector, the service sector, and the transition that we need across all of manufacturing. And that's the second point I want to come to. So the first point is just the context that we absolutely need a new social contract with labor at the center, because indeed labor's share of global income has steadily been declining. And we need to remember that that's not deterministic. It's also due to corporate governance issues. So the second point is, what do we mean by a green industrial policy? We know that in the past, we've always had industrial policy. It's not true that it's come back. We've always had it. The problem is sometimes it's been hidden, and it was just helping particular sectors, and it was producing kind of corporate welfare policies, subsidies, and guarantees for particular sectors. And the new type of industrial policy, which I have been advocating for quite some time, which we're starting to see, but not really, is to say this is not about making a list of sectors, renewable energy, AI, transport. This is about setting missions and goals for our economies and asking what it means for all sectors. So in the same way that going to the moon was not just aerospace, it required investment in innovation and nutrition, materials, electronics, and the use of outcomes-oriented procurement got us camera phones, baby formula, software, and so on. The same is, of course, true for global warming and net zero. It is not just about renewable energy. It's just as much how we build the materials like cement and steel, how we move around sustainable mobility, what we eat, how we eat. And so this idea of an intersectoral industrial policy is key. In other words, the challenges around health, around net zero, around water, which is a huge problem, and other challenges that a country and the region in Europe sets itself, we need to be asking what it means for all these different sectors. And the problem is that that doesn't happen on its own. My third point is really that in order to have an intersectoral industrial policy that is challenge-oriented and mission-oriented, we need to, again, come back to this idea of the social contract. And labor really needs to be at the center of that. So unpicking the social contract through the contracts, literally all the different contracts, intellectual property rights, public loans through our public banks like the KfW in Germany or BNDES in Brazil, guarantees, subsidies, bailouts during COVID. All of these are contracts, and they can either just be giveaways to sectors, or they can be moments where it's a win-win because that public provision of support through the concept of an industrial strategy is conditional on the private sector actually investing, training, and investing, by the way, in human capital and social capital and physical capital. And there's good examples of this. For example, in the United States, we did not have this social contract when Silicon Valley came about. So we socialized the risks there, but privatized the rewards. The companies that benefited from all the public investments in the technologies in our iPhones, the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, they were all publicly financed. We allowed then the profits to not only get privatized and not only not pay tax, but often not then invested back into the economy. As I was saying, the share buybacks have been huge in all these different sectors, including IT, including energy, including pharmaceuticals. So what was interesting in more recent periods is that when the US rediscovered industrial strategy with the IRA, I had the honor to work with the Secretary of Commerce under Biden on the CHIPS Act. And we said, this time, let's get it right. And so the over $300 billion that was given to the semiconductor companies, and think of this also for Europe because we have our own version of the CHIPS Act, were conditional under Biden that those companies benefiting do not do share buybacks, they reinvest their profits, they improve working conditions and worker pay, and they use energy efficient supply chains. So any sort of contract like a semiconductor act can embed within it green and work conditions. Another example is during COVID, the mission should have been to vaccinate the world. It shouldn't have been just to have a lot of vaccines. That's just an output. It's not an outcome. But only one of those vaccines, the AstraZeneca one, which shouldn't be called AstraZeneca because there was lots of other investors in that vaccine, it was the only one that had a good public-private partnership putting conditionality at the center. And that only happened because the Oxford University researchers paid for by the public purse put it as a condition to make sure that knowledge was shared and that costs and prices would remain low and that there would be, advanced purchasing agreements to guarantee supply, but also that the developing world would be able to produce it because of that knowledge sharing. The other vaccines didn't do that. Another example is during COVID, where in the United Kingdom, where this idea of conditionality is not strong, we gave out lots of money to sectors like aerospace and automotive, no conditions attached. For example, EasyJet, one of our airlines, got $600 million for free, no conditions on what was expected by that company in terms of working conditions and green investments. Whereas in France, the money that went to both Air France and Renault was conditional that they commit over time to reducing their carbon emissions. Again, not perfect, but this idea that we actually have to unpick any contract, bailouts, public loans. In Germany, by the way, the public loan given to the steel sector by the KfW was conditional that that sector reduce the material content of production. They didn't tell them how to do it, because that would then hurt innovation and entrepreneurship if we micromanage. But the idea that a public loan to the steel sector, which globally is asking for help, was conditional that the sector become greener, was part of the deal. So the steel sector had to make those investments in repurpose, reuse, recycle technology. And that's the only reason that steel is greener in Germany than in some other countries. And lastly, we need to remember that we live, in a world of not only inequality between capital and labor, but also the global south and the global north. I don't like those words. We need to make sure that the green industrial strategy in Europe is not hurting other parts of the world. And again, I think the labor movement could really be at the core of this, because otherwise what we get, for example, with the IRA in the US, which was their version of a green industrial strategy, are green subsidies, which then suck capital away from green capital in the developing world, which we saw happen. Similarly, the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, could have been structured in such a way to make sure that there was technology transfer and knowledge sharing with low and middle income countries in order to make sure that they themselves did not get hurt and were able to actually increase their capacity to reach those carbon targets. I'll stop now and just to say, I really think this is the moment to be asking what the labor unions' roles are in order to make sure that these contracts of different types, including water rights, by the way, Pepsi-Cola and Anheuser-Busch get water from states, and yet there's no proper conditionality in those water contracts. And we know that because 80% of industrial wastewater is not recycled. That's a crazy, stupid negotiation from the states that are giving the water to those companies. But I do think that we should always look at this in terms of how we create wealth. It's not just about redistribution to make sure that workers get their share. That's absolutely important. But making sure this is seen through a lens of pre-distribution, getting the capital-labor relations right, getting the public-private relations right from the start, embedded in all these different contracts that are essential for a challenge-oriented industrial strategy is, I think, extremely important for the discussion you're having today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mazzucato. Extremely inspiring. I've got a lot of notes here, but given the time constraints, I'm now opening the floor for a few comments or questions to Professor Mazzucato. I can see Jack. I can see Marie Carmen. I can see Dumitru. Okay, so by that, I'm closing, and I can see Claude, so that's it. So Jack, and please limit to 2 minutes max, or 1.5.
Thank you, Lucy. Good morning, Professor. Thank you for your presentation. Given the scale of the difference now, it was already there, but it's going to become very dramatic over the medium term with Trump and deregulation and all the rest of it. Given the scale of the difference in incentive for capital investment, do we not need to go further than your very welcome remarks about the use of public procurement and public contracts? Do we not need to think about slaying one of our sacred cows and bite the bullet on massive tax incentivization? Because at the end of the day, the investment gap which is now opening up, it was being denied for a long time, by the way. I recall recently, a while ago, being told by somebody from Bruegel that it didn't exist. But given the scale of the investment gap, which is widening by the hour, do we not need to think in terms of tax relief in return for social conditionality and in particular collective bargaining, in addition to the green agenda, but in particular collective bargaining? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mari Carmen, please.
I speak Spanish. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Mazzucato. Excellent, inspiring presentation from you. And it's very rewarding to hear you saying something which supports something that we've been calling for a long time. We're so surprised that funds are allocated to companies with no conditions, not just no social conditions, but they could actually be in conflict with their workers, and they actually get funds from Europe for green projects, for digitalization, despite these conflicts. And we have called out this practice many, many times in meetings with Commission representatives. It's been included in a lot of the opinions that we've drawn up in the committee as well. But we don't get beyond the recommendation stage. So I'm very happy to hear your arguments. The Draghi report, though, only talks about new potential investment in industry. But I think that this should be an opportunity for trade unions to be able to point out that the new investments go hand in hand with social dialogue and industrial relations as a way of channeling investment, because without good industrial relations then you can't actually make progress. You need decent work, funds have to be spent, but in line with a plan in place with the workers in a company to achieve environmental and green goals. Without involving the workers, we can't have new investment in companies on green projects and digital projects, because obviously the workforce is so important. And social dialogue and industrial relations should be seen as a direct driving force behind this new investment, in this new phase of investment in industry, which will flow from the Draghi report. So thank you very much indeed for your presentation, which was very much along these lines.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's a very important topic. In Romania, for instance, we are having tough talks about the contribution of the private sector in comparison with the public sector related to the national parameters. In the recent past, there is an aggression against the public sector. They want to completely destructure it, invoking lack of efficiency, the corporatist governance imposed by the OECD, and they bring to the forefront the much too high revenues, as they call them, in the state sector, related to the efficiency of public companies, but also in the public space, and the politicians' voices say nothing about what is happening in the private or corporatist sector. Many of the successful corporations in Romania that have profits of have been having profits for at least 25 years in Romania, constantly report zero profits, so zero taxes for years, although we are aware that they are in IT, electronics, and other successful sector of the national economy. And this paradox has a negative impact upon us because it casts a bad light on public companies and the fact that they have more than 90% trade unions, they have collective bargaining, and their revenues and living standards are much better than in many private companies. This is a very important element. Furthermore, the National Resilience and Recovery Plan that the professor was saying has brought conditionalities for the employees for social restructuring, but less conditionalities for the companies, to say nothing that the most recent pension law, although adopted under the current government, it is not being implemented. And many companies or corporations believe not applying it is not a problem. For the future, we should insist on better understanding the relationship between private and public sectors and the responsibilities of the companies operating on the member states' territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Dumitru. Claude?
Oui, merci. 3 commentaires en style télégraphique.
Thank you. 3 comments very quickly. The dominant narrative now is that industry is going through such difficult times because of external factors. There's an automotive company that is being closed down just nearby. But do we talk about the responsibility of employers? For years, they know that they need to move towards different types of cars. They committed fraud so as not to reveal the fact that their CO2 emissions were too high. And now they've produced a new model which is so expensive that no consumer can afford it. Those were those managerial choices which have led to industrial decline. So it's not just external factors, and I think we need to point that out very clearly. And another thing, and you, Professor, talked about dividends and stocks, but where do they actually go? They go to the United States. They're in the United States or elsewhere. They're not necessarily in Europe. And yes, there's this money that is dormant, as people say, i.e. it's in people's savings accounts. And the idea is that that should be rechanneled to risk capital. Banking sectors tend to be reticent about that. Financial markets, the secondary shares market isn't actually a market that channels investment into business. It just pumps up speculation with all of the negative effects of speculation. It would be interesting to hear your take on this, because I think that these are particularly important within our trade union strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Stefano, please, 2 minutes.
Sì, grazie Lucy. Anche...
Thank you very much. We've seen that in the Draghi report there is a direct association between industrial policy in Europe and trade policy. We're seeing a very kind of market-based approach to this, which recalls Colbert in the Draghi report. And here I would draw on the professor's presence to ask if the critical raw materials which are so essential for this dual transition, which will be both green and digital, could they trigger geopolitical tensions if certain countries couldn't have access to them? Now, we know that in a lot of countries in the south of on the southern hemisphere, this might well be the case. With those tensions in mind, should we not be thinking about how to manage them? We would need a kind of multilateral approach to managing these resources to avoid the tensions. What we're seeing with the war in Congo, I think, is a result of that, and we're seeing it once again in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So without any comments from my side, Professor Mazzucato, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments and questions. So I'll just take them in order. So the first, it's absolutely true that we need to be much more forthright, and I should have maybe done it myself because it wasn't a side issue. This issue of tax is a huge issue. Not only the tax avoidance and the tax evasion, which just in Europe, by the way, and the US is over 500 billion a year, but it's also the tax incentives, which many people don't pay enough attention to. For example, the R&D, the research and development tax incentives, have often just been a scam. They increase profits by reducing the cost, but there's very little evidence that these tax incentives create what we call in economics additionality, making investments happen that otherwise would not have happened. And that's because the incentives are based on the profits generated from the R&D instead of what they should be, and in some countries they have it, the labor hired to do the research and development. And we know there's much more additionality in the latter. And this might sound a bit nerdy, but the point is how we design tax incentives should always be looking at whether there's any evidence it actually increases the investment, or is it just increasing profits? And the second point that was mentioned, of course, these incentives should be based not only on the green direction of the investments, like the examples I gave also of green steel, but the social. And that's why I brought in the CHIPS Act as an example, where they did say that the semiconductor companies would only receive public sector support if they improve the working conditions and the worker pay. But the second question that came from Spain is also really important, because as long as those are just recommendations, it's not enough. There needs to be a legal obligation. That's why I say the contracts, we need lawyers, good lawyers, not the bad lawyers that just work for the companies. Lawyers and the law needs to change. There's a great book by my colleague Caterina Pistor called The Code of Capital. Capital code is coded. There's a legal issue there. So we really need to unpick how to bring the social at the center. And in some countries, for example, with procurement, that means a new procurement law. In some countries, it's not even allowed to put these legal obligations on companies that are receiving public support, because it's seen as, meddling too much or not just leveling the playing field, but tilting the playing field. But we should be clear. Of course, we need to tilt the playing field if we want a just transition that creates inclusive growth and sustainable growth. And it's absolutely true that the social dialogue needs to be at the center of that. The third question from Romania, absolutely. There is an explicit attack on the public sector. My last book was called The Big Con, how we have outsourced so much of the public sector to consulting companies. The con came from consulting. The subtitle was The Infantilization of Governments. By the way, the private sector also used the consultants a lot, but this lack of capacity in Italy, every time we have a riforma della pubblica amministrazione, it sounds good because everything in Italian sounds good, it's just cuts. So instead of training and investing within the public institutions to govern these difficult problems around climate, around water, around health, around COVID, we have been outsourcing these public institutions, and instead we need to rethink what the civil service is for. And it's not just to fix market failures, it's to help shape and create an economy that's good for people and planet. And your second point, which I absolutely agree with, you said that in Romania, the private sector has not done its job, which was also brought in from the next question from France. I refer to this as parasitic ecosystems, because biologists are much more rigorous with their words. If they look at an ecosystem, they differentiate it if it's predator-prey, if it's mutualistic, if it's symbiotic, is it parasitic? And in so many different industrial strategies, including the potential result of the Draghi plan, we end up with lots of public support with too little request, or how do you say, legal obligation, as I've been saying, from the private sector to do their job. And the question from France is a perfect example of this, that many of these companies, this idea that they're all having a hard time, why are they having a hard time? Because there was no obligations put on them in the past that they had to make those investments. And so now it's sort of too little, too late. And then we're all being asked to feel sorry for them instead of actually saying, hey, this is a result of a very bad ecosystem in the past. Let's learn in the Draghi report how to do it better this next time around. And so, as you said, these are not external factors as though it's from Mars or deterministic factors. These are endogenous decisions that were made or not made to, make industry move forwards in the right direction with social conditions and green conditions. But I come back to my first point about different forms of capitalism. Maurizio Landini, my good friend, as you all know him, in Italy, told me that when Ducati was bought from being an Italian company to a German company, his own experience was completely different in terms of how investments were looked at for the future in Germany, with labor at the table, business and government. It doesn't happen in Italy. And by the way, when Fiat went to the United States, it was very interesting because Fiat in Italy has always benefited from a very parasitic ecosystem. When times are good, Fiat keeps the profits. When times are bad, the state comes in through Cassa Integrazione and pays the wage bill. When they went, and Fiat does not invest much in Italy. When Fiat went with Sergio Marchionne to buy Chrysler, Obama, in a rare moment of confidence, because we had a lot of Goldman Sachs guys behind Obama, he said, in this country, you have to invest. And the hybrid engines and the hybrid investment by Fiat in the US was the result of a deal, a contract with the government, which you will remember had bailed out after the financial crisis, not only the banks, but the automobile industry. But that's an exception. We don't normally have that. And by the way, I don't think people have appreciated enough outside of the labor movement what happened in the US with the big auto strike, the UAW strike, when for the first time they struck against the three companies, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, and helped bring up the wages even of non-unionized battery workers. And so that idea that this has always been in the past, the labor movement, by winning these battles has actually helped everyone, also the non-unionized workers. So it's a race to the top and not a race to the bottom is critical. And that brings me to the last point of the critical raw materials. Batteries that I just mentioned need lithium. They need, all sorts of raw materials, which, as you say, goes to the core of a geopolitical battle. And there's already wars, not just the one in Congo. But what's also interesting is that a green industrial strategy should mean to make sure that the way that these raw materials are extracted are good ways, less exploitation. So again, we know that there's huge labor exploitation since a century with raw materials. So that has to be at the center of a green strategy, how these materials are extracted. But also lithium, when it's extracted in Chile, for example, it's extremely extractive of water. So we look like with the Sustainable Development Goals that one is tackled on electrification, but then we hurt other Sustainable Development Goals that have to do with water by extracting those raw materials in such a problematic way. And I just say this because we need a systems view. And this is why an economy-wide and a system-wide industrial strategy is critical. But the geopolitical crisis that you mentioned is why we know, and you know more than I do, that this has to be a global labor battle, not only in terms of the labor exploitation, but also making sure that what one country is trying to do in terms of its industrial strategy is not hurting other countries. And I think an international labor movement, it's a great awakening of why we need that international view, and we can't have a national kind of a view, just like we had, by the way, with COVID. We had vaccine nationalism, which ultimately became vaccine apartheid. And that's a very strong word, but that's what happens when we don't look at the system as a whole.
Thank you very much, Professor. I mean, I'm extremely happy because here, with your responses, with your presentation, it's clear to all of us, and you mentioned it at the very beginning of your speech, it's about the distribution of profits, distribution of growth, going more and more on the capital side and less on the labor or worker side. Also happy that you stressed so much the need and, in a way, obligation to invest and reinvest the profits back to the economy. The importance of a fair tax policy and taxation of the different elements in the economy. The need of really complex, holistic, on all the sectors oriented industrial policy that should be the driving force for the development, but at the same time having the social contract that would value labor and workers the same and put it into the right place so that there are really no losers and winners, but losers actually, winners on all the sides. And of course, one of your last comments on privatizing profits and socializing costs or losses. So for me, it's clearly we need to go in improving and acquiring, defending social rights and labor rights, because these are the best stabilizers, actually enshrined in the new social contract. And also what you didn't call regulation, but for me it is a regulation. So different obligations for the different actors in the economy, that we get to the balance and not the way on just cutting costs, which are always on the expenses of the workers. So thank you very much. I hope we would have chance to communicate and work together in the future as well. And now we can turn to the next part, which is the panel discussion with our panelists, mainly. Thank you very much, Professor. So let me introduce the first panel, which where we could welcome Andrew Watt, the relatively new Director General of the European Trade Union Institute. Welcome very much. We've got Tommaso Grossi, Policy Analyst in the Social Europe and Wellbeing Programme at the European Policy Centre. Welcome very much. We've got Ludovic. Welcome, Ludovic. We all know him, ETUC Confederal Secretary. And we've got Andrea Mone, the rapporteur of the EESC opinion on the future of EU industry in the face of high energy prices and transition costs. Andrea unfortunately cannot be here with us today in person, as he did have not nice accident this week in Rome, I guess. I hope I'm not mistaken, but luckily at least he can be here with us online. So, dear panelists, I would kindly ask you to limit your introductory remarks and addresses to 4 minutes, so that we have then time for some extra questions on you concretely, and then enough time for reflection, questions, debate with the audience. So, Andrew, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, colleagues. Mariana Mazzucato is a difficult act to follow, and I can't speak nearly as quickly or elegantly, but let me try to break down what I see as the key issues for industrial policy in the European context in 4 minutes, which is a second reason why this task is rather difficult. Indeed, and I will go over some of the similar ground, I have to say. So industrial policy indeed is a misnomer in many ways. We need a strategy for the entire European economy, encapsulating industry and private and public services, which are all interlinked. So Mariana talked about intersectoral industrial policy, so I don't have anything to add on that. Having said that, I mean, even if manufacturing is only around 30 million out of 200 million jobs in Europe, I would still consider it as a core sector for a number of reasons, because it's critical for technological development, for productivity growth, for exports, which are focused on manufacturing. 90% of exports to the US now are focused on manufacturing. There are big spillovers to the services sector. And of course, for trade unions, important to recognize that they tend to be the sectors where, with high degrees of unionization, good industrial relations, or at least well-developed industrial relations systems, and delivering quality jobs in many countries at least, compared to the very polarized situation we have in the services sector. Okay, so there were two questions put to me and the other panelists. Why do we need industrial policy, and how can we do it? So on the why, I mean, I don't think in a general sense that really in this room certainly would need a justification. But it's still important, I think, to focus a little bit on why we really would want it, just to derive from that also the things we want to do and how we should do them. And I will give 4 reasons, and it's a bit of an overlap here also to the Draghi report that a number of commentators have also mentioned in the last session. So the first is that Europe is falling behind on productivity growth, behind the US. And that given our demographic situation and the labour market situation, that's key for living standards, but also for fiscal solidity and also for our welfare states, that we get back to a decent rate of productivity growth. Secondly, again, emphasized by Draghi, Europe is lagging behind in a number of key, likely important for the future sectors, notably in digital technologies, and these require support because they won't be developed spontaneously by the market. The third reason is the imperative of decarbonisation, which again is not, and I'll explain that in a minute, something that can be left to the market to resolve. And finally, and that we're seeing very much in these hectic days, an international environment that is very much more difficult and combative than it has been in recent decades. We have strongly interventionist policies in the US and China. Those countries have established dominance in a number of important sectors. And now we're seeing the implications of this now, as I say, with current developments in the sort of tariff war that the new president in the US is threatening to unleash. So again, all these things, go in the same direction, in the sense that here it's about economic security. We cannot rely on firms following a sort of internal market logic, a sort of profit maximizing logic, if you like. Given the market signals that are out there, they will not resolve these problems. They will not get us into the places we need to be, and that's why we need an interventionist industrial policy or economic strategy. Okay, that actually was the easy question. I think why we need an industrial policy. The more difficult question is how. And that would really be something that cannot be certainly done in 4 minutes, not even 40 or 400 minutes. But let me focus on a few. First of all, a few problems that we need to overcome. First of all, there is no lack of initiatives. We have the state aid rules and the way they've been relaxed. We have the important projects of common European interest, the Green Deal, Critical Raw Materials Act, Net Zero Industry Act, etc. Roadmaps, pillars, action plans without end. The latest favourite word is compass. in fact, we have too many of these things, right? This is actually a problem. There's a lot of initiatives out there. We lack a coherent strategy. That's the first problem. More fundamentally, we have a coordination issue in the European Union as a result of having what I call a bottom-heavy European Union, bottom as opposed to top-heavy, i.e. one where the established member states and their own sort of path-dependent systems of industrial policy sort of dominate over a coherent strategic vision. But the most important issue that we have, and really the elephant in the room, if you like, is on investment. And we can talk all about the hundreds of regulatory initiatives, but ultimately the elephant is how do we get the investment that we need? So it's going to either be in the private sector or the public sector. In the public sector, I don't need to go into this in detail because of the European fiscal rules, because of the size of the EU budget, and because of the lack of a centralised borrowing capacity. We have very strong constraints on the ability of the public sector to drive up investment to the extent that is needed. So can we rely on the private sector? Well, unfortunately, no, partly for the coordination reasons that I mentioned before. The classic sort of chicken and egg problems that the private companies have when they decide to make investment in new areas. We shouldn't rely on the capital markets union sort of supply-side measures, expanding the supply of capital to move the dial on facilitating private sector investment. And households, but Ludwig may well make this point in more detail, lack the resources to make the sort of micro investments that we also need, classic solar panel type investments. So that's the key issue. And unless we get a solution to that, and that should be, I think, a focus of trade union campaigns, then we're not really going to move the dial. What else can trade unions do? Well, I think there are three policy areas which are related, if you like, to the core activities of trade unions, where there's a clear link also to industrial policy concerns. One is to strengthen sectoral collective bargaining. Again, I can go into this in some more detail, but the basic argument is that by strengthening that, you prevent the weaker firms in a sector sort of copping out of sector-wide deals, putting their lack of productivity, as it were, on the backs of the workers, and you force them to raise productivity or leave the market. Insisting on social conditionality is the second point. I have quite a lot of things to say on that, but as this point's been raised in the previous session, I will maybe skip over that and we come back to that in the discussion. And the last thing is to insist on the role of public services. So this goes back to this sort of intersectoral idea. Again, public services where trade unions tend to be strong in most member states, relatively strong, and insist on the importance of areas like health, education, occupational health and safety, labour inspectorates, etc. I mean, these are goals in themselves, and social goals, goals for workers in the narrow sense, but they're also part of a industry policy agenda for Europe. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's really difficult to get it into 4 minutes, but it was really comprehensive and very understandable. Without any delay, Tommaso, to you. Try to be brief, please.
Yes. Thank you very much for having me. It is a pleasure. And I'll try to be quick and time myself. So I want to begin by saying that I have... Sorry, this does not work. Thank you. Yeah, let's go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to say a few things drawing from my the chapter that I wrote with my co-author Laura Rayner for ETUC on the socio-ecological dimension of the Green Deal Industrial Plan. It came out last year, and it's still very actual because, in fact, the Clean Industrial Deal that we will see coming out in 2 weeks changed in some details. Next slide, please. So the substance, I think it's the same. So in this very short presentation, I'll try to cover the why and how of industrial policy. As you can see, there is an obvious rise in green industrial policy across economies, with even liberal market economies now favoring state interventionism in the economy. And so it was only a matter of time before the European Commission came out with its own Clean Deal industrial plan for the net zero age in 2023. Next slide, please. So the why is pretty obvious, I think, and Professor Mazzucato has explained much more eloquently than I could do the how. But I wanted to maybe present a few scattered thoughts on what this means, whether this is a genuine dismissal of previous approaches to industrial policy at European level, with the name under the label of neoliberalism, or if this is a genuine new turn towards interventionism and sustainability. And on the how, next slide, please, we now can maybe talk about a few considerations. The macro level ones have been already put forward in the previous by the previous speakers. So maybe I will focus on the next slide, which is the micro level considerations. And I would like to turn to the skills shortages and skills mismatch that are very likely to hamper the full and proper realization of a clean industrial deal with a strong social component, and especially the glaring lack of reference to the European Pillar of Social Rights, which has a strong framework for quality jobs, far from being perfect, but beyond the discursive dimension, there is no connection between the industrial strategy that was announced by the European Commission and the current and most important framework for social sustainability that the EU has in its own toolbox. Next slide, please. I'll skip this one. Maybe we can come back about on this later. So I was given two questions. How can the European industrial policy then be integrated within the objectives of the pillar? As I just said, the pillar, far from being perfect, it lacks a strong just transition dimension and also territorial perspective. So in this research that I've done for ETUC, we came up with the idea of territorializing or localizing key principles of the pillar via territorial impact assessments to understand the strengths and weaknesses of territories that are undergoing this deindustrialization, with also the aim of supporting and improving social dialogue, and with the place-based approach advanced by Andreas Rodriguez-Pose and Callum Wilkie. And when it comes to the specific mechanism that I think are important to mention to make sure that the clean industrial deal is not put forward without a strong social dimension, is to make sure that we adapt welfare states and social protection systems, because we can observe an imbalance in the principles of the European Pillar of Social Rights. Most of the principles concern flexibility and access to labor markets, in contrast to the principles that are, meant to be about the protection, the social protection of workers and working conditions. So the idea is to improve the buffer function of the welfare states, to make sure that there is also a function that builds consensus for the transition, going beyond just employment, narrow-minded measures, so activations, active labor market policies, and so on. Next slide, please. And when it comes to the indicators that could be relevant for making sure that this strategy is socially just. Well, in another research I've done for FEPS on the European Pillar of Social Rights, in interviewing trade unions and policymakers at national and European levels, one element that we understood being very important for any industrial policy, which, as we now know, has a very strong link with social policy in general, is the provision of adequate indicators which pertain to social dialogue and the workers' involvement, allowing really a participation and co-creation of policies, active labour market policies, but also, as I've just said, social protection ones, buffering policies, because this really means that we have a better understanding of what are the territory's needs, what are the workers' needs, and we really make sure that we don't leave anyone behind. I'll stop here. I hope I was clear, and I'll leave some of the other slides maybe for the questions, if there's any. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That has been a clear message. Ludovic, why and how?
So why and how? I will switch to French. Donc, le débat est...
Yes, the debate is very timely because in 2 days' time the European Commission is going to be presenting its plan for clean industry for the coming years, and the context is brutal for industry. 2.5 million of industrial loans have disappeared since 2008. Each week new restructurings are announced, or withdrawals of investments which threaten thousands of workers in car manufacturing, energy, construction, transport, technology, retail. So it really does affect many sectors. This means that entire territories are plunged into a precarious situation and anger. This is leading to a rejection of institutions and a rise in xenophobia and racism. So the clear question is, are we going to attack the causes of deindustrialization? Are the European leaders going to focus on maintaining and creating quality jobs, or will they allow layoffs to continue to rise behind them? Are they going to lead to depressed prices or greater dependence? Are we going to shift from depending on Russian gas to dependence on American LPG? The circular economy and energy efficiency fall into that category as well. Will they establish a just transition for our economy, or will we attempt to have an industrial policy which aims to manufacture as much as possible in Europe with goods and services available to our citizens? So these are the questions we need to have answered in 2 days' time. So we in the ETUC have 4 main calls. First of all, we shouldn't just be talking about long-term industry policy. We'll see when the investments arrive. Destruction of jobs is happening every day in industry, so we need to protect those jobs. Not only those jobs, but also the industrial capacity, because when a company leaves, 2 years later, it's a whole region which becomes a desert. And when investment returns 2 years later, we need to be able to preserve that industrial base, which can be a moratorium, which can be reflected by the kind of system we had during COVID, where we protected 27 million jobs. We could have something like that established to protect jobs, but with a better mechanism, a mechanism which would enable us to think about the transition. So it would be investment in the transition, enabling us to invest in training for workers, mobilising the necessary funds for the greening of companies and the just transition. But for that, we need to put a stop to this destruction of jobs that we're seeing at the moment, and we need clear statements in favour of that. There are two main dimensions here. The industrial policy has to focus on the workers and the regions where they live, and in all sectors, because each region has to have the right to a bright future, the right to remain a location in the single market, and the union movement is important for that, because we're familiar with the strengths and weaknesses of the regions where these companies are situated. So we don't just want any old industrial policy. We want one with safe jobs, one that responds to those regions that have suffered deindustrialization in the past. For example, the north of France, which is quite edifying, because for decades we've had a government in France talking about deindustrialization of the north of France. It's true that we've had foreign capital investment in northern France, mainly in high-tech companies, but mainly companies that need fewer workers. So it's a policy which has not responded to the needs of the population, people who want a job, want their children to have a job. So reindustrialization, which is digital without jobs, is not a way of avoiding the rise of the extreme right in those regions. The second element is linked to the social issue, the labour part of the transition. If we cannot purchase in Europe products manufactured in Europe, we will not have a fair green transition. So let's just take an example of traditional green decarbonisation products, electric vehicles, solar panels. If everyone has to buy them, given the cost, which is prohibitive, 80% of workers cannot buy those products. So given the current budget rules, states cannot really help workers to buy those products. So that means it's impossible to produce them in Europe with high quality, well-paid jobs. And that's what we need to resolve. So it's not just about how we're going to attract foreign capital, but what are we going to do about the products that we need for decarbonisation? How can we make sure that we produce them in Europe and we make them affordable with a strategy which is not the strategy of the big companies, which is to have high prices to make more profit. It needs to be a price that's accessible to all workers, and that will boost the greening of Europe. And social elements there as well is a tool to boost that social responsibility in Europe. Obviously, then it's going to be easier to produce in Europe. And then finally, I was saying a moratorium on layoffs is what we're calling for. I talked about industrial policy, but there are two other sectors that are very important. We needed a massive investment policy with investment capacity in Europe. We need to be able to discuss a common debt so that we can finance investments in the economy to protect jobs and decarbonise the economy. And it won't be enough to just have investments and industrial policy. We also need to strengthen workers' rights. And for that, we need a directive on the just transition, which is our fourth call. And that directive on a just transition needs to strengthen the capacity for unions to guide management in companies to prepare that change and to allow that transition to be something that workers can believe in so that they are not sidelined. Thank you.
Very much. And last speaker in this line is Andrea Monet, our rapporteur of the respective opinion. Andrea, I hope you are online.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy.
Wonderful. Good to see you, and good recovery from the beginning. You've got the floor.
Thank you. I will take the chance to speak in Italian, so I invite you to wear your headphone. Ma sicuramente.
Well, indeed, it is important that we have an industrial policy if we want quality jobs, because I think it's urgent to provide support given so many crises that we're facing workers throughout the whole of Europe. But it's also about getting high-quality jobs as well and making sure that that ties in with European competitiveness. And the more we can base our industrial policy on labour conditions, on skills and on well-being, as well as on innovation and development, the more we'll be able to have competitive products on the market which will drive European values in the international arena. And then, of course, competitiveness needs to be sustainable. Draghi said this in the report. It shouldn't be based on labour costs, but it should be focused on growth and on training and the well-being of workers as well. As we said yesterday when we discussed an opinion on industrial policy, and that our group was able to write with a number of different contributions. We hope that that will feed into the Green Deal. I think that the thing there that was important is the need for new social contracts and a greater role for the trade unions in industrial policy. In order to do this, we need to have the right kind of European industrial policy that goes beyond national fragmentation and national conflicts. We need one which is genuinely European. And I think we also need to make sure that we have consistency between the policies that we have. This was something that Draghi said when it came to fiscal policy, competition policy, and so on. And I think that there we also need to make sure that we're consistent with our social policy. We need a holistic, across-the-board approach, taking into account the internal market and the social aspect as well, which should be a strategic component when it comes to progress, as well as protecting workers. So it's essential that we have the right kind of consistency between our policies. And as Esther was saying as well, it's important we think about the concept of the just transition. If there is something which has been missing, it's been the ability to manage the transition on the basis of social sustainability and to remember the impacts that it has in our regions as well. So we need to look at that again. Now, there are some principles in the opinion that we have flagged up as being important to us, not just in terms of defining industrial policy, but also in terms of implementing it and monitoring as well. And essentially, one of these is inclusiveness and the other is participation. An effective industrial policy has to be inclusive. And what that means is that we have to preserve our industrial base, because if we don't do that, we won't be able to transform it and make it more competitive. So it's essential that we are inclusive in terms of the companies we have, not just about innovative companies, but here it's also about traditional companies as well. So we need to look at all of the companies, large-scale companies, SMEs and workers as well. And not just in some member states, but in all member states. And we also need to think about enlargement as well. That is a reality that we're going to have to deal with. So it's important that that is also considered when we think about industrial policy. And then it's about participation. We're at a very complex stage at the moment, and it's only through social dialogue, collective bargaining and the involvement of social partners that we can rise to the challenge. This is true in Europe, but it's also true when it comes to our companies. We need greater workers' participation in the companies, and this ties in with what the Professor was saying when she spoke earlier. It's about participation in companies as well when it comes to distribution of profits or benefits, so that we can shift to a longer-term approach. And the long-term investments are really very important as well. I see my time is running out. What I would just say is that it's important that we have a European industrial policy based on European instruments such as SURE, Next Generation EU and so on. But it is essential that that policy manages to withdraw, to bring down internal inequalities, we can only achieve what we want to achieve through the involvement of social partners and a focus on jobs and on people. So we need to promote European values at an international level.
Thank you very much, Andrea, that we did have the chance to have you with us for this panel. I mean, I wanted to be giving some extra question to the panelists, but they already took that much time that I'm not going to do so. And I'm opening the floor for comments, questions, whatsoever. I can see Florian, Willem Rebic, Dumitru, Filip, Mateusz. So I've got Florian, I've got Willem Rebic, I've got Dumitru Fornea, I've got Filip and Mateusz on my list for the moment. I've got Bohumir. Okay, so I'm closing the speakers list for now.
Someone from online?
And from online? Who? No?
No one.
Okay. Thanks for that. So please stick to 2.5 minutes so that our panelists are having some space for really good responses. And we start with Florian.
Thank you so much, dear Lucy. I will speak in Romanian, so please use your headphones. Înainte de toate, mulțumesc.
First of all, thank you very much for the contributions. I have 3 issues I'd like to talk about, or 3 questions. How do you see the management of transfer pricing or the transfer of productiveness made by multinationals from one country to another? We see that the added value is done in some economic sectors in Eastern Europe, but the profits are transferred to other member states. How do you see this phenomenon? How can it be managed? Because it is mainly achieved through transfer pricing. The second issue, European funds, various strategies were mentioned, and public investments. Unfortunately, what we see at this point in time, the European funds are more a kind of game between the member state and the European Commission. Initially, there is a negotiated form in public, but then it is fundamentally amended. I'll give you a concrete example. The National Plan for Recovery and Resilience, the plan that Ursula von der Leyen has in modifying the Romanian plan, or there is an impression in some member states that these amendments are used for political purposes and not necessarily to ensure and promote fair development, both in the cohesion policy, where there is too much politics in negotiating the funds and less reason for the development, and also the same thing in the RRF, if we see the recent amendment proposals from certain member states. Thank you.
Very much, Florian. Willem, 2 minutes for you.
I'm going to speak in Croatian.
What we have just heard from Florian is very worrying. However, my topic is different and pertains to a macroeconomic dimension. I would like to pose a question to Andrew Watt. All the reasons that he enumerated that are at the core of America being better in growth than Europe are very valid. However, this very body has been engaged in month-long discussions on whether euro is an appropriate currency, whether it has many problems, whether there are many obstacles for better investments and better loan policy. Many things have been mentioned in this discussion, and I'm not going to enumerate it here. However, one thing he did not mention, and I would like to know, speaking about the period after the financial crisis, what has changed in the meantime to make a currency that was not an optimal currency? How can it yield better results? What are his opinions on this? Why did the European Union prove itself to be incapable to function properly in that regard? And one thing about Vance's speech in Paris. I would like to know what exactly is the logic behind the proposal that increased regulation stifles innovations. I can understand that it probably stifles the profits of big tech companies, but how on earth could it stifle innovations? That is something that I do not understand.
Thank you very much, Philip. Dumitro, your 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. On the industry and new forms of promoting industrial investments throughout the world, I've recently visited China in Shanghai in December, and I had a chance to see the new models of cars manufactured by the Chinese industry. Of course, they integrate various innovations that have their origins in Europe. A lot of companies from Europe contributed somehow, in between inverted commas, to these new innovative models of cars. The question is, what should we do for the future to adapt the industry? Because many of our economies are dependent upon the motor car industry in the EU. If the Chinese come and invest in Sweden, in Volvo, they wanted to come to other areas in Europe, but the position of our governments was very strict. Under the presidency of Mr. Biden, any intention to have Chinese investments were rejected, also in Romania. Or in Saudi Arabia, BYD, the most famous company in electric cars, invest in Saudi Arabia and Brazil. They wanted to invest in Serbia. We saw the reactions. The question is, what should we do for the future to attract a different type of investments in order to succeed to do what they did? They copied the European innovation, but now, because we are too arrogant, we cannot establish relationships by which we should learn from them the latest technologies that they develop so successfully and create surprisingly good quality products. We did not expect this with the surplus related to what we have in Europe. They are at least 10 years ahead of us. This was a question for the colleagues in the industry.
Thank you very much. Philip, please go ahead.
I have a question to the panel, actually. Of course, it's about the industrial policy, which remains fragmented across the European Union. And the question is this, actually. Do you think the competitive compass goes far enough, actually, to develop a coordinated approach to industrial policy in the European Union? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Mateusz?
Dziękuję, Pani Przewodnicząca.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
We have been discussing various topics, and that shows that industrial policy is a very complex topic. Let me add one piece in this puzzle. We need to have good jobs in industry. We have the sector of artificial fertilizers in Europe. That sector employs several thousand people. These are good jobs, but we are not able to protect this sector against unfair competition. Many artificial fertilizers arrive to the EU from Russia, and we are reticent to launch actions in order to combat circumventing sanctions. The question to you: is it necessary to be more active with respect to our trade policy to protect some sectors in the EU? And we can be more independent, we can be more competitive, we can have more autonomy, and such sectors will contribute to development, growth, and more competitiveness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mateusz and Bohumir.
Děkuji, Lucie.
Thank you, Lucia. I was listening very attentively to this discussion about what European industrial policy should look like. And because I'm a trade union person, I'm always in favor of social policy. Any policy, but always social policy. There's been a number of remarks where profits are going, how companies are behaving. A lot has been said, and I think we need to be strong now and make it clear what we think. We're talking about support of industry, but we should provide support to mainly employees. And European Union is talking about supporting social dialogue, but here we are in a trade union forum. So let's answer this question. How have we achieved? How have we been doing in terms of supporting this really at European level? And we need to have a clear strategy. We need to define clear social dimensions of any policy. Thank you.
Very much for very interesting, very diverse questions, some to all of the panelists, some to the concrete panelist. I mean, I know it's not nice, but please limit, all the panelists could respond to the different questions. Please limit yourself to 4 minutes, and I'm going to be strict. So, Andrew, would you start, please?
Yes, thank you very much. So, one colleague from Croatia, I saw on the screen, I'm not sure exactly where you're sitting, addressed me with a question about the comparison between the US and over here, thank you, and Europe. I mean, that's also a complicated question. I mean, I think first of all, we shouldn't accept that the US is ahead of Europe on a lot of measures. So there's the focus on GDP levels and things like that. There are indicators where the US comes out ahead, and that's emphasized by people like Draghi. I mean, I don't think we should accept that. If you look at other things, if you look at productivity measures, for example, if you allow for distributional matters, if you allow for working time and things like that, then you get a somewhat more nuanced picture at least. But still, what is of concern, and I mentioned that in my initial statement, is this predominance of the US in a number of sectors, tech, normally called tech sectors. I mean, just how serious that is, I think, is still not quite clear, because we don't know whether, in particular, AI is going to be a massively transformative technology or not. But I do think it's wise to be, to err on the side of caution here, and to try and close that gap. So to that extent, this idea of sort of learning from the US is not a bad one. The question though is, what should one learn from the US, right? What is good about that model that we should be thinking about? And if you look at what's coming out of the Commission now, it appears to be very much this deregulation agenda, right? So, the US is a more deregulated economy than Europe, and now our friend Elon Musk is now trying to deregulate it even more. And that seems to be the main focus. And I would think that that's something we really need to fight back against very much. If you look, and I think this was alluded to by the questioner, if you look at the problems we still very much have in our macroeconomic policy settings, in our economic governance region, that's actually the core issue here. I mean, if you think about the fact that the USA, for example, the famous 3% deficit rule we have in Europe, the Maastricht deficit, the USA never once in the last 20 years met this deficit, right? So, I mean, if that fact were better known in Europe, then I think we'd have a better discussion. I think there are things we can learn from the US. Unfortunately, I think we're learning rather different. Seem to be learning, or the Commission wants us to learn rather different things. Just last sentence on the competitiveness compass again. That's a longer discussion. There's a short piece out on the FES website, IPS, you can put in IPS, where I go through the competitiveness compass and analyse some of the strengths and weaknesses of that, but I'll just make that reference here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Andrew Tommaso, your 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Although no specific questions was asked to me, maybe I can pick a few. The first one on the competitive compass. It is not a yes or no answer, in my opinion. Surely there is a lot of details to be unveiled about that, so it's a bit early to say, but so far we can see that there is no strong reference to the European Pillar of Social Rights, no reference to the Council recommendation on the fair and just transition, no clear reference to roadmap for quality jobs, which is, announced by the European Commissions. Though there is reference to skills and quality jobs overall, no strong link between these elements that I've just mentioned and the competitive compass make me think that they will be incorporated more strongly in the future. So let's see. It is also about politics, very much about that. In the presentation, maybe you could see very briefly I've addressed the issue of different priorities within the Commission, with different DGs pushing for their own agenda. I don't think we will see a Ribera versus Séjourné fight, but what if there is no convergence of interest in this regard? This is something that we will witness in the future. And I'll maybe also answer the question on good jobs in industry. Absolutely, I think that is the vulnerability that we need to address. Again, it's not just about providing people with the right opportunities, but also making sure that there is the necessary upskilling and reskilling mechanism to make sure that these jobs happen within working hours, are provided by the employers, and that there is enough time and capacity to make sure that the workers adapt to the changes of the markets. Without forgetting, of course, that, as I said in my presentation, it is not just about activation measures. We need to make sure that social protection systems are fit for the green transition. Only by doing this joint effort, activation and protection, we can make sure that there is a solid and robust framework for quality jobs that ultimately will also have a very strong political impact. There was made reference to the far right by Ludovic. I think this is an important element that we need to take into consideration when we talk about phasing out of jobs for the sake of decarbonizing the economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ludo.
Oui, merci. Merci pour les contributions.
Thank you for the contributions and the questions. On competitiveness, first of all, I'll come back on the other points afterwards. On competitiveness, I think we need to think about the way things were before we had the compass. We were already focusing on competitiveness. The Lisbon strategy said essentially that Europe should be a skills-based or knowledge-based economy and should be the most competitive economy in the world 10 years afterwards, and that was 20 years ago. Well, what's really changed? Not very much. I think that competitiveness was always one of our focuses. What is new, perhaps, in the discussion about competitiveness is the current trend for deregulation. The whole issue of administrative simplification or cutting red tape, and that's what's new. So it's difficult to discuss competitiveness and without talking about deregulation. But I think what is missing from that discussion is the whole issue of low pay, poor working conditions, and poor quality jobs, and how much those actually hinder competitiveness. To some extent, it's the result of job shortages in a lot of sectors. One of the brakes on competitiveness for many companies is that the poor quality jobs that they're offering and the low pay means that workers are not coming on board helping in the shift to decarbonising the economy. So poor jobs have an effect on the competitiveness of European industry. And that's what we should be talking about, rather than just talking about administrative simplification to make things easier for businesses when it comes to respecting laws. We could have some kind of agenda for employees instead, because often they have lengthy procedures when it comes to getting social housing, declaring accidents at work, access to social support, and so on. But that's not the kind of simplification that we're talking about here. Well, it could be said that that's one of the reasons why a lot of employees are not having their rights respected. So I wonder, really what this discussion about competitiveness is really about and where it could be going. The question from Mateusz as well. Yes, well, I mean, we do need to protect some of our sectors in Europe. This was part of the opinion which was adopted by the executive committee in October. It's about protecting jobs, and that's also true, but we need a job protection mechanism, a mechanism which tackles unfair competition and excessive investment costs when it comes to shifting towards a cleaner economy. So I think that that's very much, the sector that you mentioned is very much a sector which would be part of the mechanisms involved to protect and transform our industry. And then on competitiveness transfers between member states. This is one of the major problems. We're seeing that when companies close down, it's large companies which shift to another European member state or out of the EU altogether. And sometimes these are multinationals with sites in different places, and they shift from the European Union to another company. Chiara, for example, a Belgian company, is going to produce fertilizer in Brazil and then import it back into Belgium when it used to produce in Belgium itself. And that's something that we need to tackle. These are profit-focused strategies within a group itself, and those harm workers in different countries. And if we don't tackle that, it's going to be difficult to solve the problem.
Thank you very much, Ludovic. And Andrea, I hope you are still with us, so you've got your 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'll try and come back on some of the questions which were asked on the competitiveness compass. What we're seeing is an attempt to tackle the challenges which Draghi brought up in the report, the competitiveness and innovation gap, and the need to reduce our external dependencies. So increasing our strategic autonomy and focusing on decarbonisation without that leading to deindustrialisation. I think the problem is that we need to take some of the aspects from the Letta and Draghi reports which focus on social inclusion, because essentially it's about how we're going to tackle the issues before us, which will affect how effective we're going to be about that. So rather than the objectives, the question is, how can we make sure that the objectives are achieved in a sustainable manner? So, of course, that means, for us, greater trade union involvement. I fully agree with what Andrew said when talking about the United States. This comes in the Draghi report as well. They have greater capacity for innovation, but of course there are also huge inequalities in their society, lack of social welfare. So we shouldn't be importing the negative aspects that they have in their society. We should be putting forward the value of our social model, and there I think the social partners should, in inverted commas, be able to promote that model as a basis for European Union competitiveness. So that's something we should be flagging up as well. And then another question is to do with support for companies and how we can ensure that the transformation we want to achieve is sustainable. I think this is essentially about EU-level investments, which could be public and private. And here I think the only way we can make sure that investments can lead to social development, therefore through employment, is to tie those in with social conditions. Something which was missing in the Net Zero Act is to make sure that we're not just supporting internal demand, but there also needs to be financial support for companies with strings attached, social dialogue, the participation of workers, and so on. So we need to ensure that there is this link between innovation and social standards as well. To round off, I'd like to mention deregulation. And this is something, I think, which comes back to what Professor Mazzucato said, to do with the way that companies should be sustainably managed. We need to make sure that in the transformations taking place, the trade unions are there to make sure that those transformations are sustainable. So within this framework of administrative simplification, which could hide a lot of deregulation, and we need to combat that, we also need to remember that we can offer innovation when it comes to state aids. The Letter report is very clear there, and it says that state aids can be tied in with transnational projects, and that could be the best way of avoiding dumping between member states. So there, it's important that we need that we flag up that these processes should involve the trade unions, because that's the only thing which would allow us to make sure that we have sustainable, high-quality labour conditions throughout the whole of the EU.
Thank you very much. Thanks all the speakers for their responses. I mean, I've got heaps of notes here from the debate, from your interventions. I mean, for me, what is really crucial in this is we shouldn't be copying the US and getting into the race which we cannot be winning. We should rather build on the strong points which we are having in European society, in European economy, and try to improve those elements which are actually barriers for cohesive, well-educated society, which is the best contribution towards economic performance and productivity. I mean, Ludovic mentioned the barrier for competitiveness are low wages, are bad working conditions, are precarious, bad jobs which are on the way. So we should concentrate on improving these elements, because welfare state, social Europe, is our biggest advantage compared with the other parts of the world. So for me, this is clear a push on improving on the social rights, improving on the workers' rights, and actually not accepting that deregulation is the only way and the way we should be choosing for improving competitiveness and actually the performance of the economy and of the societies. I was happy to hear, or happy, in commas actually, but to hear clearly being said that we are not having a consistent approach towards industrial policy. That still until now, these are rather 27 industrial policies in the different states, and the truly consistent approach is still missing, although, I mean, the papers are on the table and Commission at least, is trying to show that they are serious in this. Important to stress again that our best tools are improving and strengthening collective bargaining, social conditionalities. Happy to hear about the important role of public services which are here. But this all for me is actually our European social model. We need to defend, we need to develop, and we need to improve. Being said this, as we are still having the second part after lunch, let me thank to all the speakers, extremely interesting, I enjoyed a lot. We are definitely going to be continuing in that issue. Andrew, we are going to be preparing our own initiative opinion on productivity. We hope in a way or another we could involve you, because I know that you are quite a lot oriented on this, so the different aspects and how to use it, and so on. So big applause to the speakers, and see you at 2:30 for the second part. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, colleagues. I've got a couple of takeaways myself from this morning before I introduce the panel. And I think the first of those is that work is your lifeline. And And being asked to give up one lifeline before you can grab the next one is very, very, very difficult for any worker and very difficult for any discussion. And I also know that some of you in the room are intimately involved in the ongoing discussions and in supporting workers who are faced with immediate job losses. So just to recognise and thank you for what I know is a very challenging task you're all involved in. We heard this morning about the absolute importance of the challenge in relation to we must call for investment. We need to be very attentive to state aid, but also to the way in which taxes are being used. But we mustn't make the mistakes of the past. We must make sure that we're not socialising risk and privatising profits, but rather the other way around on that, making all of the work that all of us are doing on the social conditionalities so essential and important. We also began to touch, and I hope we hear a bit more later today, about public services, because public services should be seen as a factor for competitiveness, an essential building block for the industrial policy. It's as important whether there's a road to transport the goods as it is what's in the supply chain. All of those questions, the electric infrastructure, the cost of energy, the role of public in all of that, very important. And then finally, this question about, do we need a regional policy, we need a place-based policy, we need a sectoral policy, we need a European policy, and we need an international policy. So how do we bring all of those different parts together? I hope we can also have some thoughts about that this afternoon. And that's why I'm so happy that the first speaker I'm going to introduce is the General Secretary and my long-time friend, Judith Curtin-Darling, who is doing this for real in industrial every day, having the discussions, leading the discussions on a clean industrial policy for quality jobs. So, Jude, Oh, have we first? Yes. Oh, sorry. Jude, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to... Hang on. Yeah. So get ready. I'm coming to you in a minute. So first of all, we have a video message from Teresa Ribera, who's the Vice President of the European Commission, and she will be delivering a clean, just and competitive transition. So let's give the video over to Teresa.
Hello, everybody. I'm truly sorry that I cannot join you today, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to share a brief message with you all, you who represent our workers, the backbone of Europe's social and economic prosperity. We are at a critical turning point for our future. It is vital that we ensure Europe's sustainable prosperity and competitiveness, while at the same time we preserve our unique social market economy and our core values. Together, we must seize this moment to build a Europe that thrives on innovation, sustainability, and above all, good quality jobs. The upcoming Clean Industrial Deal, together with the Competitiveness Compass, are our plan for driving growth, innovation, and boosting modern industry in the European Union through decarbonisation. But let me stress one point. This is not merely an environmental or an economic agenda. It is a generational opportunity to lay the foundations for a sustainable, resilient and socially just industrial policy. It is not going to be easy. It is challenging, but we can do it together. It is essential that our ambitious industrial transformation plan is a good deal for workers as much as it is for industry. People, workers, consumers are at the core centre of Europe. Our commitment to achieving climate neutrality by 2050 is non-negotiable. To achieve this, we will invest in clean technologies such as renewable energy, hydrogen and sustainable manufacturing to make Europe the global hub of innovation. However, this transformation must not come at the expense of jobs or rights of workers. It must be a driver for job creation. We have examples of this. In 2022, the European renewable energy industry employed around 1.6 million people. Reaching our energy targets will require the creation of over 3.5 million jobs by 2030. At the same time, we need to ensure that we are not overly reliant on external suppliers for critical goods, technologies or materials. But strategic autonomy doesn't mean isolation. On the contrary, it means fostering fair trade, co-development and global leadership, built on a foundation of strong labour and environmental standards. This cannot be a race to the bottom. Europe must lead by example. We need to prove that globalisation can work for workers by creating quality jobs with decent wages, strong social protections, fair conditions and solid environmental standards. Tackling labour and skill shortages is also a matter of urgency. Ensuring that the education, the skilling, upskilling and reskilling, that our investments in decarbonisation include robust support for workers through reskilling and upskilling programmes is essential to stay competitive. The pace of technological change demands a workforce that is continuously supported to learn, adapt and grow. Between now and 2029, we know that almost 200,000 workers will gain new skills in projects financed by the Just Transition Fund. But more needs to be done. People must be at the heart of our policies. No one can be left behind in the transition to a cleaner economy, and unions, workers, need to be around the table to take these decisions. This is why together, the Clean Industrial Deal, the Union of Skills, will be one of the most important milestones to deliver on these next 5 years. To meet our goals, we need to work closely not only with member states, with industry, with leaders, but also with the civil society and its representatives. Every decision we take has to be rooted in trust in our institutions, trust between member states, trust from the citizens that we, from the European Commission, serve. Our policies must reflect fairness, ensuring that our industry, region and workers can participate and benefit from this transition. Without this foundation, no policy, no action can truly succeed. This should be Europe at its best. Together, let's lead with vision, courage and purpose to create the future we believe in, and that future, the future that generations deserve. Thank you, and I wish you a fruitful discussion today.
Jude, you've also heard, if you want to pick up any of the points from the Vice President, to be very happy for you to do that. I think the question about workers' rights, collective bargaining, not just being add-ons, but also what you really want to see in the next, say, 6 months coming forward. I think that would be really helpful for everybody to hear.
Thanks very much. So first of all, thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks to the Workers' Group and the ETUC for organising a discussion about industrial policy. And I think the timeliness is right there in terms of having a more detailed discussion of what we want collectively as trade unions in the package, because there is going to be a lot coming in the next few weeks, and it's important that we all kind of know where we stand in relation to what's coming. Thank you slightly less for organising it on a Friday afternoon, but that's just a personal thing. I came this morning. I missed the beginning of the meeting because I came this morning from Istanbul because of the strikes yesterday. The flights were cancelled, which is great. Well done. Massive congratulations to the Belgian unions for the mobilisation yesterday. There were a lot of industrial workers together with their confederations in the streets yesterday, and there were lots of banners that I saw on social media of Belgian industrial workers taking the same demands that we had in the square opposite on the 5th of February, also towards the Belgian national government. And I think what's very important is that we don't just need a flagship initiative from the European level, but we need a concerted effort from the European level and the national level. And at this time, that's obviously an extremely big challenge for Europe because of all of the political realities that we know. But the situation is extremely serious for our members. So Ludovic this morning was giving some of the figures. Since the great financial crisis, we've lost something like 2.5 million manufacturing jobs in Europe. But if you actually look when we lost those jobs, the large drop in manufacturing employment came with the implementation of austerity. It's actually austerity and fiscal restraint which has a direct impact also in terms of industry. The danger that we face today is that we are in a far more fragile context in manufacturing for multiple reasons. And lots of them were said this morning. We, as Industrial Europe, are very clear that our industrial counterparts and the employers have a major responsibility in the situation that we're in. Many of the roofs have not been fixed while the sun was shining. We've seen historic profits made in the last few years in a number of sectors. We have seen strategies by companies such as Stellantis and others of profit maximisation, radical cost-cutting, which have stripped industries right through the supply chain, so putting pressure not just on their own workers, but workers right through the supply chain, and underinvesting, as Mariana said in the case of Italy. It's extremely scary if you look at the level of production capacity in Italian car sites at the moment, what the future in the Italian automotive industry will be without, at the one hand, an industrial policy at the national level and an industrial strategy and plan at the European level. So the situation is critical. Our employer counterparts have a part to bear. What I was struck by this morning in the debate was that two key topics which are always raised in our meetings didn't have the prominence that I thought that they would have here. The first is that one of the reasons why we have such a critical situation in the energy-intensive industries has been the high energy prices in Europe. And we can't talk about an industrial policy and a plan for the future unless we're talking also about a strong European energy policy and dealing with high energy prices, even more so if we look at gas prices today as a result of the announcements just in the last few days and the impact that they've had on the energy markets, that we see this fluctuation intensifying the pressure, particularly in energy-intensive industries, at the same time that those industries have enormous investments to make. And there are bad corporate players in those sectors, but there are many good corporate players in those industries as well. And I think it's, I feel like I also have to speak up for those who are doing the right thing, who have long-term investment plans, but have found that the energy prices and the impact of austerity and fiscal restraint means that they are facing massive investment with their hands tied behind their backs and with very low cash flow, in some cases negative cash flow, in order to make those investments. That's a very complicated situation. At the same time, the second issue which wasn't raised this morning, which is really critically important for us, is what's happening geopolitically around the world. We see a massive amount of overcapacity coming onto the global market. In China, we have seen something like, I'm not going to say the right number, 25 months of deflation, an economy where actually the whole economy is shifting towards exporting that overcapacity. That is pulling prices down. I'll give you a very concrete example. Coil of steel, to produce it in Europe, you can't go effectively below 800 euros or $800 for the coil of steel. And we're seeing coils of steel on the market at $500 coming, because not just from China, but because of the effect of massive overcapacity in the global market. So in this context where we have an enormous investment gap at the beginning, we're not creating the framework in order to create the necessary investments which are needed for the transformation of industry, for the maintenance of those jobs. So I just want to really highlight the point which was made in the first panel, that investment and the investment framework is absolutely critically important. And if there isn't an investment package brought alongside whatever the clean industrial deal looks like on the 26th of February, then it will be a package which is about window dressing, but not about concrete measures which are needed to deal with industry. What we need, and I know I've got to be short because that's fair, but what we need basically is firefighting measures to deal with the immediate crisis that we have in industry today. We need to protect workers. We need to, and I insist that it's about worker protection and not necessarily job protection. Our members know that jobs are changing, but what we need to ensure is that workers are protected in this crisis. That's why a SURE 2.0 programme is critically important. But we also need to be protecting industrial capacity. And we need to avoid that we lose critical industrial capacity in Europe, which we are now in danger of doing. And that means that we need urgent demand-side measures put in place. And there are low-hanging fruit that we could use. Public procurement is the quickest, the easiest thing to use as a lever within the single market. We already have the possibility in European legislation to have social conditionalities on public procurement. That should be seen as a key way of driving demand in the initial stages. And all support to industry, however that support looks like, whether it is state aid, whether it is support in terms of credits, whether it's support in terms of permits, auction rights, all of that support to industry should come with social conditionalities attached, because that's one way of levering in that demand side. And fundamentally, we need action on energy prices and quick action on energy prices. But we don't just need to fight the fire, we need to prevent future fires. And that's about a longer term agenda of the industrial plan. It's about lead markets. It's about ensuring that just transition is threaded right through the proposal. It's about dealing with some of the sacred cows which exist at European level. We have to reform the electricity market design and the energy markets. We need to have a conversation in the trade union movement, and it's starting inside industrial, about local content. It's very controversial, but 2 weeks ago, the second president of IG Metall gave a press conference in Germany calling for a proportion of local content in all, in terms of all public support and public procurement. We see this rising. It's the top demand of our employer counterparts. And the debate will come in the next few weeks about what place there is in terms of local content. We're also, not everything is bad in the world. We are still exporting, not as much as we did, but we're still exporting. So we also have to avoid that we get into trade wars. So we have to be very clever in how we build this industrial policy, in also building international alliances and recognising that we don't penalise those parts of the industry where we're exporting. So these are some of the elements which for us are absolutely critical. But I would just really like to thank you all for your solidarity with our members. And we had this rally in the square opposite on the 5th of February. That's just the first stage of our mobilisation. We've decided to have a second stage, which will be a week of action at the national level. Dates to be finally decided, but probably, depending on some national strikes, probably starting about the 10th of March, going until the 18th of March, in order to send a very clear signal to the European Council on the 20th of March that there isn't any time to waste. We know many of the solutions that we need, but we need the political consensus and the will that action has to be taken really urgently. Otherwise, unfortunately, as Europe, we will see deindustrialisation on a very large scale and all of the social, economic and political consequences that that will bring with it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jude. I like that message. No time to waste, which is a very key one. And sure, there'll be lots of questions about those points that you put forward. But I'm going to go over now to Angelo Pagalera. I hope I've said it right, Angelo. Who is the rapporteur for a challenge for the single market, a European defence policy well balanced with the needs of citizens. If you can pick up that question of the local content as well, because I think in the idea of defence industrial policy, that being, I think, a critically important question, particularly with the amount of spend that Europe's going to probably, or the member states are probably going to be pushed to make. And then also this other question, how do we make sure that the money doesn't come out of the social and the other objectives, and how do we make sure to attach the social conditionalities in this context too? Thank you, Angelo.
Switch to Italian. Sì, grazie.
Thank you, Esther. I'll try and be as concise as possible, given the time and given that it's Friday afternoon. We decided to work on this opinion to do with striking the right balance between defence policy and citizens' needs, because there's been quite a lot of bias in the debate recently. I think perhaps over the last year, really everybody's just talking about spending on defence. When we're talking about stability and austerity, now that was what we talked about in the past. Now, essentially, we're just talking about how we're going to get enough money together for defence. And nobody, of course, is mentioning how we should fund social investment. Up until recently, we talked about investment plans and a sovereign fund for industrial changes in policy, but nobody's talking about that now. It's all about defence, defence, defence. Last week, there was an extraordinary European Council meeting about defence. I suggest you read the conclusions. They were more detailed regarding the investments in defence than usual. As far as the rest of it goes, the electoral platforms, debates, now, well, nobody's really talking about social investment. So what we're trying to do by working on this is not provide necessarily a different point of view, but to try and provide a balanced one, i.e. between these two needs that we have. Of course, we need to invest in defence. Nobody would deny that we need to strengthen our defence capabilities. But at the same time, we need to ensure that our social welfare systems, our healthcare systems are on a stable footing. I think that we're all seeing a running down or weakening of those systems in our different countries. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody here. And as I say, that's what we're seeing, but nobody seems to be casting any doubt, as I am not, on the need to strengthen our defence capabilities, but we need to strike the right balance. When talking about the European defence, I would say that the point of the opinion is to try and see it as a reason for joint a joint investment. One of the first exams I did at university on European history was on the European defence community, which is something that ran out of steam back in the 1950s. And that's a thing which, you know, I think it is worth looking at again. I think that this is still a topical issue, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to look at that. Again, why did it fail, though, at the time, all those years ago? Well, it failed because some member states, including Italy, was going through a different context or different situation from the one that we're facing now. And I read some of the records of the EDC, and there it said that NATO was going to be prioritised as the best defence option for Western Europe. That's what it says. It says that NATO was going to be more able to defend Western Europe. And that's changed quite a lot since then. So perhaps there are other lessons to learn now. The European defence community involved joint investments, joint objectives, and so on. That could be a good source of economic integration as well. If we think about spending, as I say, we're all hearing about the importance of developing investments in defence, but what are we actually talking about? In 2024, the European member states all together, there are some that spend more than others, but they spent 35% more than in 2022, so spending is up. We've got 27 different investment systems, duplication of effort, and a certain amount of waste as well. And if we look at the estimates from both the Commission and the European Parliament, given the current levels of investment, we could have the same objectives, but if we had greater coordination of spending, we could save 30 to 50 billion. Now, say per year, say we saved 30 billion per year just through better coordination of military spending of the 27 member states. It's an enormous amount, 30 billion a year. That's 300 billion in 10 years. And that perhaps could be used for something else. And this would be achieved simply through better coordination. I was talking about the EDC, the defence community, and so on. But here, I'm just talking about the current way that things are done and coordinating that better, and that could save 30 billion a year. Moreover, according to the European Defence Agency estimates, if we had a more integrated model, we could increase our defence capabilities as well with the same budget. Now, it is true that we're talking about the need to increase our spending as a percentage of GDP, and many member states spend less than Russia and the US in those terms. I looked at some research from an institute in Stockholm that said that in 2023 Russia spent 5.9% of its GDP, which is $400 billion US dollars. In the same period, the European Union, including the UK and Norway, spent 1.9%. But 1.9% of the EU's GDP is 530 billion. Now, if we took UK and Norway out of the equation and just thought about the 27 member states, last year the 27 member states invested as much as Russia did in defence. And I think that shows that it is possible to strike a better balance. And I think that we need to have another look at it, to take a more rational approach to it. There are other aspects which tie in with industrial policy. Later in his report, I'm quite neutral about it. I don't have a particular opinion on it. But I know that Judith knows a lot about this through her role in Industrial. If we were to invest more in defence, we would be producing in Europe. And so there's another political aspect that's worth bearing in mind here. We would be producing things in Europe using the European Union's companies. Of course, we could get third countries to do it. That would be an answer that, or a question we would have to deal with. But I think it's fairly clear what kind of response we should be giving to that. The opinion is we'll be working on within the coming weeks. We do need to improve what we're doing in terms of defence. We need to invest more, but we need to strike the right balance, and we should not be endangering our social security and welfare and healthcare systems in order to increase defence spending. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Really clear, and I think that the point that you made at the end about the local part is something that we definitely will come back in the discussions about it, also at the invitation of Jude. And I think this is the value of this joint meeting between the EESC and the ETUC, is we have an opportunity to open up the discussion around some of the big ideas. But talking of big ideas, so very happy to welcome one of the people who's leading on the big ideas in the European Parliament. So Estelle Koolmans, who is S&D MEP coming from Belgium. She's the EMPL coordinator and rapporteur for the report on workers' rights in restructuring, and a long-time trade union member official and trade union leader too. So Estelle, the European Parliament is working on all these issues. Can you tell us a bit about what's going on and what the big opportunities for us are, what the challenges are? Estelle.
Merci, Esther. Thank you, Esther. I will speak in French if it's possible, because it's my mother language, and my English is not already fluent, totally fluent. Donc merci.
Thank you very much for this invitation on this fine Friday afternoon to present to you the challenges facing the Commission, the challenges facing Europe, and what is happening in the European Commission. I can also say something about how we're working on employment and social affairs. Well, we have the 5 main progressive groups working together. One of the main problems that we have in the Parliament at the moment is 25% are from the right wing, not particularly in favour of protecting workers' rights or union rights. So at the moment in our committee, our employment committee, the 5 progressive groups have decided on a working programme among ourselves without having to count on the ECR or the Patriots that are sort of, and ESN, which are outside of our cordon sanitaire, if you like. So we've drawn up our work programme, including a number of initiatives, legislative and non-legislative in nature, and focusing on a number of concerns that have been put forward, namely by Judith. And one of the own initiative reports that we hope we'll have soon is the one on social conditionality, on public procurement, because 14% of European GDP is invested in public procurement at the moment. And there are times where we see that this does not create quality jobs or provide social concertion. The other dossier that we're going to be working on is subcontracting. This is something you're familiar with in your sector and also in construction. This is
an issue. There's a lot of abuse in subcontracting, and there's all the middlemen that intervene at different stages along the chain. And we're going to be working on another file, which is the right to training, a right to training. It's not that easy. It's not going to be easy, but if we want to have workers that are skilled, reskilled, and that can hold responsibility in companies, then we really need to have this true right to training. So that's for legislative and non-legislative files that we can get to work on quite soon. And then we have a number of... So the first ones that I mentioned are non-legislative. And then we have the legislative files more immediately. We have the impact of AI in the workplace. You know that Europe has already taken a number of measures on digitalisation and AI, but nothing on how that impacts workers. So there we will probably include a management by algorithm, which falls under the Platform Workers Directive, but we need to continue to work on this because management by algorithm is particularly damaging to working conditions for workers in many sectors, be it logistics, be it cleaning. So we're going to be working on that. The second thing we're going to be working on is quality jobs and working conditions, particularly preventing psychosocial risks, mental health in the workplace, burnout, stress in the workplace, in order to better support that, because that is what we need to do to improve the working conditions of many workers. There are plenty more files. If you like, I can give you a full list of the reports we're going to be working on, but one I can mention here is that we would like to ask the European Commission to propose a directive on the just transition. And the way I see it, there are three transitions. There's the digital transition, the climate transition, and also reindustrialization. For me, that is a third and enormous transition that Europe needs to engage in now. So this directive on the just transition, and this has been said by Judith, aims to protect not only employment but employees, and that major transition is going to mean that many workers are going to be the victims of restructuring. That's already the case, but it's also going to mean there's going to be a need to adapt jobs. So we need to preempt those changes, preempt those restructurings in order to avoid unnecessary loss of jobs, train the workers, ensure a minimum income with programs such as SURE that we have seen following major crises here, where we can guarantee at least partial unemployment benefits in the case of major restructuring. So that's what we're going to be working on. Furthermore, there are other files of importance for workers that were already in the pipeline. The revision of the directive on European Works Councils, because we know that that directive is in place, but it's insufficiently respected by businesses. So a mandate has been issued, which needs to be confirmed by the European Parliament, following questioning by the extreme right. And we know it's a bit like the Loch Ness monster, but if we wish to improve worker mobility, we need to work on the 883 regulation on coordination of social protection schemes. So it's important to work also on supporting internships, teleworking. So there are certain files that were already in the pipeline. Some are already on our table in our committee with the 5 groups that I mentioned, keeping the extreme right outside anything to do with social protection and workers' rights. And furthermore, we should be having a vote next month in the plenary in Strasbourg on a resolution. I'm a rapporteur on this, and it's on a restructuring. It's a resolution. Well, you'll say that's just a resolution. It has already been approved in our committee, but the vote will take place in the plenary. It's just a resolution, but not only does it address the concerns that Judith mentioned, but we also recall that we need to preempt restructuring, protect workers and citizens during the transition, invest in innovation and strategic sectors, and give workers equal access to training and protection in the case of layoffs. So this is a red line that we wish to maintain in our work programme in our committee, which is to ask the Commission to propose this directive on a just transition within the framework of the revision of the public procurement directive by including social conditionality. Because unfortunately, public procurement often creates bottom-of-the-barrel jobs, and we are following this red line throughout this resolution. So that's why it's important to include that, given the challenges facing workers. Well, is all well in the best of worlds? Well, we've got this work programme, as I said, in our committee. Perhaps I can say once again that in the European Union, Commission and Council in particular, things are very tricky. Even in the European Parliament, we very much hope that this resolution and the other texts will be adopted, but it's becoming more and more difficult to get majorities that are, I can't even dare to say progressive, but being able to adopt a text like that has become trickier, much trickier than it was during the previous Parliament, when we had texts, for example, on minimum salaries, etc. So we've got a part of the EPP that look for alliances with part of the extreme right, not Patriots, but ECR. So it's not easy to get those majorities in Parliament. We'll see next month whether this resolution carries it off. But apart from that, in our committee, we were lucky to hear our Vice President, Teresa Ribera, and we will have Roxana Mazzucato as well, who is now in charge of social protection. Now, it's not easy for her either, because the President of the Commission has totally taken on the reins of power, and doesn't seem willing to share that power. And if you look at the mission letters for the different commissioners that came from von der Leyen, what we see is missing is the right of initiative. Unfortunately, even if Parliament calls for legislation initiatives, the initiative has to come from the Commission. Under the last Parliament, we had at least 7. Under this Parliament, we have 0. Reference is made to the right to disconnect or management by algorithm, but we're not even sure that we're going to get those texts. So that's for the mission letters that were confirmed when the college was confirmed in November, and then end of last month, you'll have seen, based on the Draghi report and other reports, Ms. von der Leyen submitted her competitiveness compass. We're not against competitiveness, but as union organisations, we're not against, although in Belgium we're very much familiar with a 1996 law which enables our salaries to be blocked. So this competitiveness compass falls under a certain concept of competitiveness, a version of competitiveness that is quite restrictive for workers. It's ambitious on development of AI. Clearly, Europe needs to catch up on matters of AI. We would like AI, a kind of AI which is not just in the hands of big companies, but that also creates jobs and is better regulated. And that's why we need to have a regulation of AI in the workplace. Now, when you talk about AI today, you're talking about an investment plan, because it's high time to invest in the transitions. But nothing is planned for that compass so far. The Clean Industrial Deal is part of that compass and should come out on the 26th. We'll see what it contains. But clearly, without investment, without an ambitious plan, it could be quite problematic. And what are the other problems with this compass, particularly the way it's drafted? Well, it contains an important chapter on simplification. The shock of a simplification, as some are saying, or deregulation, where you have 3 omnibus pieces of legislation that contain many different things. There'll be a list of many pieces of legislation. And when you talk about simplification, what usually falls by the wayside is environmental and social legislation. They're the ones the most vulnerable to attacks. We've seen that at other times as well. So we'll see what happens with this omnibus legislation. We're fearing the worst, so we'll be paying particular attention to that. Ms. von der Leyen also came back with a ghost from the past, something that was on the table but was rejected at the time. It was the 28th regime for companies that are active in different EU member states, and they could depart from national regulations on economic affairs or workers' protection legislation. So we'll see. I think we'll need lots of mobilisation to fight against that. And I can also say that, unfortunately, we're just coming back from Strasbourg this week, not in the best of moods, because Ms. von der Leyen presented the Commission's work programme for this first year, and unfortunately there is nothing concrete on some of the texts that were in the pipeline and should have been landing on our desks quite soon in our committee. For example, European Works Councils, not there. The 883 regulation, not there. Nothing on interns. And under social fairness and competitiveness, you see union of skills for this first term. Training of workers is important, but there's also portability. And unfortunately, we fear that the right to training will not be in that programme, and it says that this is a non-legislative initiative. And then the other points, for the end of the year, we've got the action plan for the establishment of the social rights pillar and a roadmap on quality jobs. 2 non-legislative initiatives, once again. and once again, we do not find the elements that we wanted to see included. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that because I think I've said a lot. Are we going to throw in the towel? No. I think we need to support our European commissioners. Will be so Ms. Mazzucato, our commissioner, will be heard on these legislative files in due time. So, as I was saying, in the Parliament, it's a configuration which is quite new, given the new majorities, but we'll keep struggling on.
Yeah, and you can rely on us as allies in these fights, and that's what the discussion needs to get to now, because we're in this space of, like, we absolutely need to defend and make sure we don't go backwards. But at the same time, we need to move forwards. So we're trying to find this right approach on the right issues at the right time. And that's why this discussion is so important. So we've heard a lot. So we've heard about the Clean Industrial Plan, the Just Transition Directive, a SURE initiative, the right to training, investments, social conditionalities, the local requirements, the defence industrial policy, climate, also climate preparedness being part of a defence or certainly a preparedness discussion, the role of public services, but also for the just transition, I think we also need to, if I can also put into the discussion, agriculture, because there was a big sugar industry, for example, and that's not had a just transition or a fair transition, and also services, so many jobs being transformed, jobs lost. Thinking, for example, of banking because of digital. So that whole big discussion is, say, as well to be part of this. And energy, as Jude said, that, are we really bringing that in enough? And that if that wasn't difficult enough, on top of all of that, we have the almost daily threats coming from America about tariffs. And then this question about, is a response to tariffs to put tariffs on products, or is it to put it on services where the surplus is? And I'm very happy Tanya says she might want to give us some of the views as well on that. Or is it that we look for a SURE type initiative to protect workers in this circumstance, both their incomes and their jobs? Like, how are we all thinking about that? Because it's not a decision-making meeting, but it is a thinking meeting. How are we thinking about those questions? What do we need to take into account? What do we not need to be distracted by? What do we need to focus on? What are our principles that we bring to the discussion? And what outcomes do we want to achieve? So very much over to you. I'm happy that we have an hour to be available to discuss among ourselves, so people can take, depending on how many people want the floor, we can decide on the amount of time. But I think 2 or 3 minutes is probably a good amount of time because then we can all stay focused. I'm asking Yolanda to help me with all of the names, so if you can just keep your hands up until we have you all. My first person is Maria.
I'm here. Thank you. I will speak in Spanish. Perfecto. Todo el mundo listo. Muy bien.
Thank you very much for what you've said. There are many things that resonate with me. I'm very happy that we have this level of maturity in the debate here. I wanted to say something about industrials protest the other day. I'm from industry as well. We had people from Spain who joined in as well, and I think it's very important to create that kind of collective conscience and strengthen that collective experience. I liked the atmosphere, the music, the atmosphere of celebration. I very much enjoyed it, and I was very happy that each person could speak their own language, because apart from verbal language, the force and the enthusiasm could be transmitted more easily in one's own language. I don't understand all the languages, but one of the things I heard concerned me. I understand the debate about the just transition, the green transition. I know that debate has progressed a lot. We've moved out of the phase of questioning things. Now we're in the phase of this triple transition, and as we've heard from our speakers, it's about not so much about protecting jobs, but protecting the people, the workers. I'm aware that in our different regions, the regions that we come from, the debate is not as mature as it is here at the European level, and we might even have electorate in our regions from the extreme right. But I'm bothered by the fact that leaders having a voice at the event were using expressions of the extreme right to break the ideology of the Green Deals. That perhaps hampers this cohesion and prohibits us from moving forward together. There seems to be a growing trend to try to protect our own individual territories, our own individual factories, villages, rather than having a more European or global vision. And I think as a union movement, we need to step back a little bit, take a look at our own reflections in the mirror, and realise that we're not necessarily protected from the extreme right, and perhaps reevaluate so that we can move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree. It was a great demonstration, and we all raised our voices in all of our languages to call for the just transition, and it was a great moment for us. We need to keep up that energy, and the demonstration yesterday here in Brussels also joined that. But I've been at demonstrations in Greece recently. I was also one with Jude in Sweden as well, and I feel the mobilising. I feel the building of the unity, and that's really where we need to get focused. Cinzia, over to yourself.
Grazie. Thank you. I wanted to make a comment, and then I have a question for you as well. So I've got a couple of comments, really. When talking about defence, I think it would also be nice if we were talking about how to build peace as well. Not all of the EU's public is hell-bent on military investments and on a militarisation of Europe. There are quite a lot of people who want to see peace, want to see the peace built up, not a peace imposed by Trump as he's doing now in Ukraine, but another kind of peace. In terms of alliances, I agree with what Esther has said. I think we need to take a practical approach. Unfortunately, we've lost alliances in the Parliament and in the Commission. The Commissioner that we have is quite isolated. Fine words are okay, but there isn't really enough behind them to allow us to make proper progress with them. So when it comes to the legislative initiatives, which we've looked at in the last 5 years, Well, we're not really seeing much interest there. It's going to be difficult, I think, to make progress with those. So we need to try and think where our real battle lies. And what we want to pick a fight over. I would agree with what was said this morning about the competitiveness compass. All we hear about now is competitiveness, simplification or streamlining, and skills. That seems to be it. But when we're talking about investments, we heard this morning that we don't have enough investment, enough public investment. The role of the public sector is important, tenders and contracts, revising state aid rules and so on. But the real issue is to do with public investments and the new rules of economic governance. I mean, it's excessively complex. If we don't have a kind of European system for sharing debt, we're not going to get very far. As a trade union, we have our position on this, but where do our allies lie? Who can we say to that this is the instrument that we want if we want greater investment? Just a bit of public investment in a few member states simply won't be enough, based on the fact that, well, some countries might have a bit more disposable income, a bit more ready money, but that's just not going to be enough. What we need is an EU-wide approach. And this morning, I didn't really hear very much about that, even from Professor Mazzucato. So it is a good idea to talk about public investment, but I think we need to go deeper into that.
Claude. Thank you, Teresa.
Merci. Très rapidement.
Thank you. I'll be brief. Yep, the deep concerns about what's being rolled out with these free zones. We're being told that this is a pilot project, but then afterwards we know that it's just rolled out further, and that's what we've seen in the past. It's the same with simplification. We remember from the past what the slogans were: better regulation. But, you know, one thing is approaches, but why are we doing this? It has to have an aim, and at the same time, it has to meet that aim, and we can agree with that. But in the past, we've had objectives, percentages, and so on. And the whole thing just comes back to a kind of deregulation. This discourse about simplification is something we need to tread carefully with. In terms of yesterday's demonstration, some of the comments made by some of the Belgian representatives, I just think I'd like to say you've got two parts of the government. You've got a nationalist right part that wants to separate off the north of Belgium, and then you've got an ultra-liberal part. And these two get on very well. And why? Because they have one thing in common, and that is that they don't like the Belgian state. On the one hand, they would like to have their own state or their own country. In the other one, they see the state as the backstop of regulations and so on. They want to get rid of all that as well. So I think that we need to be careful about that, and I'm hearing a little bit of the same ideas in Group 1 as well, and we should watch out for that. the boss of the Liberal right-wing party, the leader of the party, is not even in the government because he's shirking his responsibilities there because he's actually very wily. But in terms of the demonstration and the trade unions, what's being said? Well, they're saying that the trade unions don't actually want to debate things, but they can bring everybody into the street with their cans of beer. So it's all the kind of rabble-rousers and malcontents with a cheap beer. That's what's been said about our demonstration, and that shows a distinct scorn for the world of work and for workers as well. This is the kind of thing that some are also voicing in the European Parliament. Not Estelle, obviously, but I'm talking about the far right. Some members of the EPP, I'm quite happy to say that. It's the kind of thing that they say, and we need to be very carefully. We need to tread very carefully about that too. Judith, if we want to combat the extreme right, we need to meet the needs of our workers, because the people who are going to lose their jobs, you can tell them whatever you want in terms of transformation theory and what's going to happen, but we need an answer for them in the short term, because otherwise they will be easy prey to far-right ideologists.
Vasco.
Merci Esther, c'est toujours difficile de parler.
Thank you, Esther. It's always a difficult task to speak after such an elegant speaker as Claude. In terms of the Belgian trade unions, I'd like to thank you for the different panelists that are here for the organisation of this event. I think that with the challenges which we've looked at for the European economy, the energy system is one of the major ones facing us. Now, all energy systems are the backbone of a national economy. And the fact that Europe is facing problems, and the fact that the economic motor for exports, Germany, is going through its second year of recession, I think is very telling. An awfully large part of that is issues with the energy sector. One of the things that feeds into the rise in prices is the war in Ukraine and geopolitical issues. Now, there's not an awful lot we can do about that, and if things, change there, it doesn't mean that prices are going to drop from one day to the next. But for the countries in the East, I'm from Bulgaria, another issue that we have with energy is the Green Deal. 40% of our electricity is generated from coal, and with the price of emissions, this is pushing prices up. Sometimes we have to import energy, and we're on the verge of a kind of energy collapse in the country. After Trump's rise to power and all of the changes taking place throughout the world and in Europe too, some people have started to talk about Orban told us that this would be the end of the Green Deal. And von der Leyen is saying that there will be changes made to the Green Deal. Judith, I think you mentioned climate change. But what should we be doing on this? Should we be pushing for more substantial changes? Or will we just accept what the Commission gives us in the Green Deal? That's my question for you. And Estelle, you talked about the issue in the Social Affairs Committee. I think that after the elections, the European Parliament is more fragmented now. And you said you were trying to forge coalitions. Just by way of information, on the Patriots in your committee, there's Mr. Volgin, who is a Belgian member of the Patriots. And he's a very provocative person. I don't know if you've heard him speak, but he is a left-winger. So when looking for allies, perhaps that might be a possibility, because under the previous mandate with the directive on adequate salaries and so on, it's difficult to see how we're going to keep that going in the upcoming mandate, and so I think we need allies. So that might be an opportunity there.
Sophia.
Thanks. Well, usually Lucy encourages us to speak in our mother tongue, but I'm afraid when I speak about something where I get emotional sometimes, I tend to use Viennese or Austrian words, and this might be a bit too much for the interpreters. Because when we speak about industrial policies and so on, we always have this lament of the employers, and we have it with the whole competitiveness issue. We know that employers, companies are very, very poor these days, and that they are overburdened by regulation and workers' rights and so on, that they have need of public money to be innovative, that they need less regulations and so on. So I think we all know that the lament they're repeating day after day. But sometimes I like to look back a little bit on the facts as well and what they've been doing in the past few years and decades. And from a trade union perspective, we know that there has been outsourcing for years. So they've always been looking for the cheapest places to produce. So first it was eastern parts of Europe. Now they're losing the jobs that have been lost a few decades ago in the western part of Europe. Now it's going to Asia. We also have to be blunt that European companies have been very reluctant to innovate. So when it was about digitalization, they were really reluctant to put something into place to, work on research on themselves. And when we look at the automotive industries, I don't think I need to add anything. They really missed a lot of chances to be future-orientated. So I think we need to state those facts as well in the public discourse and in the political debates, because it's not the fault of the European Union and the regulations, but they made a lot of mistakes themselves. So they should look at their own problems before pointing the finger. And I actually want to give an example to you, Estelle, as well. When it comes to the use of public money and European money, I'm on behalf of Industrial, EWC, as a European Works Council coordinator in one company, in this case in the semiconductor industry, with a large base in Germany, and they knew that they might lose some jobs in the future, but fortunately there was an IPCEI coming along and they saved the site for the next few years. They will innovate, they will keep the workers there, but at the same time they already have a huge location in Asia, and they know that the next 3 years will be used, of course, to still produce here in Germany. But after that, they know they will have to negotiate huge mass redundancies. The site may be closed totally or minimized to a very small amount of people, and the whole production will take place in Asia. And I think these are some kind of realities we are looking at. So we're using public money, we're using European strategies that help on the short term. And of course, all of the workers are happy to have a job for the next 2 years, but they also know at the same time that in a few years, these jobs will be gone nevertheless. And we have put a lot of public money, taxpayers' money, into the research taking place here in the next few years, the production taking place in Asia. And so I want to actually echo a little bit Cinzia, that we really need to have a broader look on these finance calls. Public investment, of course, the question of the capacities of the European Union and the member states, especially, looking at possible austerity regimes in the next few years, but also to be more provocative when it comes to the use of private money. There has been such large dividend payouts that are really remarkable and nobody speaks about. And I think we really need to be outspoken as trade union movement as well to challenge them there, to point the finger and tell them, look, there is money around, but you choose to pay it to your investors instead of using it to innovate, to use it in Europe on the sites and to make progress here. And I think this would be one part. I know we can't solve the problem and it's still non-legislative, but I think we need to be in charge of the discourse as well.
Florian.
Thank you so much. I will speak in my mother tongue since our president is recommending us to do it. Mulțumesc frumos.
Thank you very much for this debate. I would like some replies about the social aspects, how to approach social conditionalities in the CAP. My feeling is that we reward the employers that they observe the legislation in that member state. When we refer to social conditionalities, we should take into account the fact that the conditionalities should preserve and support and consolidate social rights. Then what was said about public procurement. At this point in time, we have in legislation social clauses, green clauses, but we need mandatory rules in the member states so that these public investments should really contribute to the preservation of social rights. Mention was made of state aid. It is more than obvious, and I have a question for the panelists about the need of managing state aid at the European level. I come from Romania. What we see now, production relocations from west to east without any added value at the EU level. Or this is done with the public money support, no matter from which country, but there is no progress as a European economy. At the same time, we need to be, the way Cinzia was saying, to be more cautious when speaking about public investments. Let us take the cohesion policy. We fund development and at the same time poverty is going up in some regions, so it is more than obvious that we need a reformation of the way in which we fund and use public money when talking about the policy of reindustrialization. I believe we take too lightly some statistical anomalies. Poverty at work. It is more than obvious that these statistical indicators should be publicly combated when we speak about the future of European industry in which these anomalies should no longer exist. An EU reaction with cohesion, with solidarity should exist so that the indicators should be removed from the public space because they are nonsensical from a moral point of view if we look at the values in the EU treaty. Somebody mentioned energy. I come from Romania. I'm involved in collective bargaining. It is not hard, but very hard to explain to some citizens or companies or trade union members how a state that has energy resources, important resources, pays the highest price for energy in Europe because those resources are used not necessarily for the interests of other states, but for the benefit of other economies. We should have a narrative that leads me to the next question that defends solidarity, because European solidarity needs to be defended. Why? Countries in Eastern Europe, and especially Romania, are under the siege of Russian propaganda. So I believe our narrative should take this into account. And to conclude, the last question, what are we going to do with the European companies that use and observe the social rights in their countries of origin, but do not observe them in other member states of the EU? Thank you.
Manolo.
Muchas gracias, Esther.
Thank you, Esther, and thank you to all of our speakers this afternoon. I think what you've said is very interesting, particularly given the current times. In March, I will have completed 37 years working in the car manufacturing industry, much of it in Volkswagen in Barcelona, and I've seen how things have changed very much, how we've shifted from globalization to another kind of model, involving more isolationism. I don't know. It's difficult to see the world changing so quickly, and some of the people who are, seem to be in charge now. But this is what we've got, and we'll have to try and combat it as best we can and look for alternatives. It's easy enough to define the problem, to describe it. It's about saving costs, or shifting to look for cheaper sources of labour, for example, in China. But it's not just about labour, it's also about know-how, engineering and so on. And now things are going well for China, with 25 million students coming out of the universities every year. They are doing things fairly well now. But I think there is some lessons for us to learn here, particularly from the car manufacturing industry, and that's not to give away all our secrets. For other industries, we've got a challenge. We're facing challenge as well. Some people have mentioned those sectors, defence, for example. It's important to remember the EU is the third largest economy in the world. We've got knowledge, we've got resources, but there are changes which will be required. We need to restructure and come up with a way of doing things, and perhaps what happened in the pandemic, where we tended to share more, mutualise more, that might work for us. But there are risks, of course, and that's the rise of the third right, and of the far right, and of course they see us as an enemy as well. But we need to be careful we don't end up in some kind of deregulated Wild West, which seems to be what Donald Trump wants to see. I think that these things, particularly when it comes to the defence industry, with the potential that we have in the EU, I think we should try and draw on the potential that we have. This touches on what Angelo was saying. We have the capabilities, but we should not end up dependent on others simply because somebody says, well, we need to increase spending for NATO. It shouldn't be to the benefit of the military, the industrial military complex in the US. I think that we should try and learn lessons ourselves so that we can grow there. Further things as well, which we should think about in terms of our industrial policy, we need to think about renewables. I mean, in Spain, given the climate, now 70% of our energy comes from renewable sources, but the EU needs to find its own model so that it can use that to power competitive industry. And I think that we should be also looking at the connections between universities and companies. I think it's important, if we want to make progress quickly, but along the right lines. We should not be saying that competitiveness can only be generated through deregulation. That's simply not true. It needs to be done with the participation of workers. The countries which are doing best are the ones that have involved workers in the changes and where you have a pleasant working atmosphere which is productive. So I think that despite our difficulties, we need to implement some of these ideas and make sure that trade unions, the role of trade unions is protected, because we are very much in the front line and we are there and able to protect our society so that people can live fairly and decent lives in those. Thank you.
Thank you. Christophe.
Thank you. I will speak in French. Je vais faire une intervention qui...
My comments might be somewhat shorter than some of my colleagues. I was very surprised to hear von der Leyen's response to the protectionism being espoused by the United States, which is to turn towards China and look for partnerships with China. And I'm a bit surprised about that, because we're being flooded with electric vehicles from China which are 40% cheaper than the ones which we can produce here. Moreover, that with about 2 years lead in terms of technology, all the young people are trained in AI. So it's going to be very difficult to compete with China, given the fact that they're protecting their own economy as the US protects its economy. As some have said, we have investments which are perhaps not up to the mark in terms of our market. I think after COVID we managed to get 800 billion to try and get the economy going again. What have we done with that money exactly? We're supposed to be focusing on innovation, but I don't really know what's happened with the money. I mean, you need a doctorate in bureaucratic procedures to actually fill out some of the forms in order to get co-financing. I think that's a problem. Well, I think we're also looking at financing businesses and startups, and that's the point of things. That is true, but what's going to happen is that we finance them, and then 4 years later, off they go to the US or India or what have you. So we need to try and avoid that as well. I think that we need to have a Buy European Union Act. We can't have tender procedures where we open things up to India or the United States. I think we should be restricting things to the European Union. I think, though, we should try and do that at a European Union level rather than the way that's being done in some countries where people are certain countries like France or so on are encouraging people to buy French. We need a European Union approach.
Thank you. And the last speaker I have on my list is Dimitru. If there's anybody we've missed, if you can let us know. No, then Dimitru.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to compliment something that Judith, Christophe and Florian were saying. Structural aspects related to the markets in the EU and the possibility to maintain manufacturing capacities on the European territory. Recently, we see new markets emerging for us, and we should play these cards. I'm talking about Ukraine, Syria. We had a debate here in the external relations section that the Syrians are asking us to relax the sanctions against Syria. Syria is a proximity market. We should talk about or think about Libya and the Maghreb. These markets should be part of the zone of influence of the EU, and we should have opportunities there to distribute European products and to use raw materials and the production in those regions. So establishing these win-win relationships for both sides would be important. We've done this We did this years ago, but because of the conflicts created by the Americans or other forces that were interested in, that we joined without having a direct interest, we lost contact with these markets that used to supply everything we needed. Libya and Algeria gave us the cheapest resources of gas and oil that we could have ever had. In Romania, we had a lot of geological exploration programs for Algeria and Libya, and they have significant deposits and reserves. It would be a pity not to have access. Syria ensured all the market of grains, just like Egypt, plus the countries in the Middle East. So there are specific opportunities for each member state of the EU, but we should avoid the trap of bureaucracy that was mentioned. When talking about external relations in the EU, many times we are just talking about development cooperation that have a humanitarian but not also an economic or commercial aspect. I understand the moral aspect that we should help some countries in the world, but at the same time look at the changes in the world, what the Chinese are doing, what the Americans, Russians in Central Africa, in Goma, in Congo. We should be much more pragmatic, and as trade unionists, we are interested in creating stable jobs, creating opportunities to supply services in Europe. And these are aspects of survival, and what happens with this market is important. We established a network of FTA agreements with 45 countries, but we should very seriously assess what we are going to do with these partnership agreements and how beneficial they are for us. Because in a logic in which we have America first, Russia first, China first, Europe should find its place in this mad world. We should maintain our manufacturing capacities and trade contacts and diplomatic relations with the countries that in their turn are like-minded and want to cooperate on mutually beneficial basis. This is my remark about the trading area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now to the panel, 4 minutes each. I'm going to stopwatch, so I'm gonna time. So you won't be able to answer all the questions. You won't be able to, even engage with all the ideas. But if you can treat this as like concluding remarks, the comments that we heard, the discussion, what's your final sort of wrap-up point? But I would like everybody to answer one question, which is the one which was, I think, put very well by Sophia, which is, are we being too deferential to the CEOs and their 4 million plus shares packages? Are we being too deferential to them? Should we challenge it a bit more? Just to ask that question. So, and that's to all the panelists. So Jude, over to your good self first.
Well, when 2 weeks ago in the strategic dialogue that von der Leyen organised on the automotive sector, there were something like 20 CEOs from across the automotive sector in the room. And the first point on my list of points was, while they all arrived with a begging bowl calling for support for the European Commission, was to point out the scale of extraordinary profits which have been made in most of those companies in the last few years on the basis of an economic model which, as I said, is all about profit maximisation. And it's all, there are lots of comments that have been made which I would have, it would take a lot longer than 4 minutes to come back on, so I won't. But I think the analysis that you made, Manolo, of what's going on in the automotive sector is exactly right. The difficulty that we face is, and I think this is at the heart of the question in the clean industrial deal, is that we know where we have to get to by 2050, which is why the objectives of the Green Deal for our executive committee remain the objectives of where we've got to get to. There is a consensus that the Green Deal is still the right direction. The discussion is about how we get there. And it's about the way, the policy measures which are put in place. And the lack of an industrial strategy alongside the climate targets has been one of the fundamental weaknesses. The second fundamental weakness, which I hope that the Commission will not repeat on the 26th of February, was that there was no social pillar directly integrated into the Green Deal. Now, if we have a clean industrial deal, which again has no social pillar integrated into it in a substantive way, then we are, I fear, just creating future, if you wanted like corporate jargon, bottlenecks, and if you want human jargon, major issues for workers down the line, exactly because of the reasons of labour shortages, skills shortages, the lack of a framework for job-to-job transitions for workers in different sectors. And there are clearly sectors where the workforce are at the actual coalface in Europe, and there are sectors where the workforce are at the proverbial coalface of the changes which are coming. But that's why the Just Transition framework is so critically important. That's what we've been saying now for years. The problem is that now we're no longer talking about a transition which is on the horizon. We're right in the middle of it, and we're having to deal with restructuring without a framework which is adequate to meet the restructuring. So you're absolutely right, Sophia, that we have to call out the profit maximisation strategies and the profits which are made. But maybe it's a wrong approach, but I'm not somebody who believes in kind of a black and white view of the world, a positive or negative. I think there are shades of grey, and that's where our allies are. Because our allies are in the players in the corporate world who are playing the right game. And there are voices in the corporate world who are playing who are doing the right thing, and we should be building alliances with them. Because what is happening, this whole simplification, Claude, you're absolutely right. Simplification at the moment is a deregulation agenda. They don't want to talk to us about how you could simplify the different provisions on transition pathways in the 6 different pieces of legislation to create a Just Transition Framework Directive, which would bring together those reporting obligations on transition pathways into a single piece of legislation. That's not simplification for them. Social conditionality in public procurement isn't simplification, as the excellent work by Unia Europa, the ETUC, has been a very good argument, counter-argument has been made, that we have to expose the fact that it's a deregulation agenda. And I think we also have to say very clearly where it's coming from, because where this is being driven is by American multinationals in Europe. It's American Chamber of Commerce, it's the big US energy companies who don't want legislation which has extraterritorial coverage that hits them and their operations elsewhere. And they have put massive firepower into lobbying against European legislation. And I think, yes, call out the profiteers, but also call out those who are pursuing that very Trumpian agenda in Europe, and the cowardly, I would say, European employers who decide that it's a good, every crisis is a good opportunity to get a little bit more, and a little bit more opportunity to squeeze more out of the lemon, and the profiteering model. So I think there's a narrative to be built. We have to build it very quickly. But our reflection in industrial Europe, when we saw the competitiveness compass, was, we've read this document before. It was the Lisbon strategy. We're returning to the Barroso commitment. For people who've been in Brussels for too long, like me, it's like a replay of the period of the Barroso Commission. What happened during that time? As a union movement, we were constantly in defence. We were constantly on the back foot. And I think if we're going to learn lessons from what's gone wrong in industries and put them forward, we also have to learn that lesson for ourselves, that if we put ourselves in defence, it's very difficult to get into offence and to get it. You know that from a football match. Once you think you're losing, it's very difficult to build up a team to go and win the match in the last 5 minutes. So we have to collectively build our mobilisation and our offensive approach in order to take on, because these are massive force. They have so much money, they have so much power, that it's only unity in the trade union movement which will bring it together. So the last point that I just did want to mention is to come back to Maria's point about different things which are said on stages. Now, unfortunately, I don't speak all of the languages that were spoken in our demonstration, but there are many of our members who don't necessarily share the view of our executive committee on some of these questions. We are a wide and pluralistic trade union movement across Europe, and people express themselves in different ways. And I was very clear to people that when they were coming to Brussels, we had a unified stand of industrial workers coming to show an image of industrial workers standing together at European level. What people said in their speeches, we didn't police. So what they said was their choice and their responsibility in their speeches. That's the way of it. But the view of industrial Europe and the view that we took from the street outside into the European Commission with a delegation of 8 trade union leaders was the common perspective of our executive committee. And I think the way that you win over those who are anxious about change, and there are a lot of people, and they're growing, who are anxious about change, because I've been on the streets with Dana in Ostrava, where we've lost thousands of steel jobs. People would very much like to be able to say it's because of the European Union, because of the Green Deal, that we lost those jobs. Thankfully, in that case, we have a terrible employer who is a better target than perhaps the EU in the immediate instance. But it's very easy for people to succumb to easy answers. And that's our job collectively, all of us, to make the case that actually we've got an alternative. But to do that, we have to be on the offensive. And we have to bring those different voices and not isolate them, because in that way we lose them. We have to bring them with us, and then we have to convince them. We organise, we educate, and we agitate. That is the lesson of the international trade union movement, and that's what we need at the moment as well. Thanks. Sorry.
Because you had to travel so far to get here today. So Angelo, over to yourself, your reflections and.
Sì, io sarò molto breve.
Well, I can be pretty brief because I would quite happily repeat what Judith has just said. I fully agree with her. Perhaps I've got a couple of comments, though. In terms of industrial questions and transition, we are going through a crisis, that's clear. We don't have the necessary instruments. We're not getting those through our politics, and it's pretty difficult to do anything without the necessary instruments, and Judith said that, and I agree. In terms of deregulation, we heard about the 28th regime or scheme on this. From a personal point of view, when I heard the proposal for that, we haven't actually had a chance to read it yet in detail, I was somewhat dismayed by it. Because I said, well, this is the 28th scheme of this kind, devoted to startups and innovation. Well, maybe if it was well designed, then scientific research might well benefit from that. That said, between that idea and a regime where national collective bargaining and other rights are completely overlooked, and we're just looking at a scheme which is only for certain kind of highly specialized companies which are highly innovative, perhaps in the area of artificial intelligence. I would say there that, well, we as trade unions need to be involved in shaping this further, because I think it's just not satisfactory the way that it is. Judith was talking about US lobbies pushing for greater and greater deregulation, but I think that the way that the Commission is handling this is being particularly embarrassing. As many of you will know, I'm following, or I'm doing the opinion on e-declarations to do with cross-border customs procedures, and the Commission has put forward a proposal which is essentially focused entirely on deregulation. Now, we're in a study group with a member of Group 1 who is very much thinking along the same lines with us, and we met with the Commission just recently, and I asked for a Commission rep to be there, and I asked them why they were doing what the point of their proposal was, and they said it was to try and streamline or simplify procedures. But there, what emerged from the discussion is that it's clear that the Commission's proposals are essentially flagship initiatives which are not consistent with what is being done in other areas, because the director for the ELA was coming back with different answers to what the Commission representative in Brussels was saying. So there was an inconsistency there. I mean, it was kind of amusing to see it, but I think there are some issues there. On green claims, at the moment, things are blocked in trilogue because the Council wants this to apply to micro-sized companies as well. I don't see how this is going to work at all.
Thank you, Angelo. 10 seconds to spare. I'm very grateful. Thank you. Estelle, I need to keep you on the clock as well because we need to finish on time, and I need to give Lucy time to give her conclusions. So,
yeah, thank you. Sur l'extrême droite.
On the extreme right, Belgium does have a firewall, but Mr. Gulgin is not in the Patriots. He's in the ESN, so that's the most extreme. But the thing is, okay, the extreme right is saying that they are there to defend the writers, but they're actually anti-trade union. I looked at Mr. Gulgin and his voting patterns. He abstained when the whole of the extreme right voted against. But I don't think that he's going to save us. I don't think that can be an alliance. I think the important thing is to call people out, and when real progress is being voted on, they vote against that. On the cohesion funds point, cohesion funds and defence, the European Union is not planning to get into debt as recommended by the Draghi report, i.e. another RFF. But cohesion funds, that's a major part of the budget. The European Social Fund, also Regional Development Fund. But these cohesion funds, we were concerned that these funds would be cut to use that money for defence, and they are going to be merged. The European Social Fund often doesn't have enough funding to combat poverty and unfortunately the budget doesn't allow it to do as much as it could. And the thing is that the problem is that the European Social Fund might be merged with other funds, so that's something that we're going to have to take action to stop. And the whole issue of structural reform, the RFF, which in Belgium was linked to a reform of the pension scheme. Thank you very much. Plus, the thing is that there's the risk that there'll be this general fund which will all be attached to reforms that have to be made. And this is it's very interesting the way in which Ursula von der Leyen talks about this. On investment, this competitiveness dogma, austerity, that's a particularly popular slogan. Over the last crises, we actually suspended the implementation of austerity policies. And in Belgium, actually, austerity policies were particularly tough, very much at the expense of workers and those people who get social benefits, rather than perhaps going for the route of fairer taxation on big fortunes. But unfortunately, now it seems that Europe isn't able to do this. But looking at what happens in Europe, what happens in Belgium, what happens elsewhere, there's a book, Shock Theory, Naomi Klein's book. And I think that that is what we're seeing here, the two major crises, but we're being told the same story, i.e. how we get out of this is austerity, etc. Clean Deal, Buy European Act. Yes, we can talk about that. So I can allow perhaps Esther to conclude now, but thank you very much indeed for inviting me here.
So before I actually give the floor to Lucy, who's the co-organiser with the ETUC, two things I want to do. I really want to thank Yolanda and Lorenzo because of all your hard work to make it happen. So really, really, really want to... I could see all of the... And I know Lucy could as well see everything that was going on to make this happen. To also thank the speakers, but I know Lucy will do that more elegantly than myself. And one final thing, to ask all of you to come on the 3rd of March at 5 o'clock to the launch of the legal arguments on how we can protect collective bargaining in public procurement. So you heard Professor Mazzucato say what somebody needs to do is to put these legal arguments together. Well, the ETUI has done so, and there's a joint ETUC-ETUI event on the 3rd of March to actually launch those legal ideas, legal approaches, different ways of doing it. Not, there are lots of different ways to achieve the outcome, and that's the purpose of the ETUI legal opinion paper. Is the different ways to do that, and I very much hope that you can all join with us at that event, and more importantly, to advocate and to feel confident about advocating that it is indeed possible. And that's the final thing then for me to say. But even when we are right, and the depressing thing is our economists are always right. We're right. We're proved right time and time again. We were right about the fiscal rules giving rise to a new austerity programme. We've been right and right and right. But we haven't been listened to in the way we should have been. And I think that's why the mobilisation is so important. I think that's why demonstrating is so important. Different ways to take collective action is going to become more and more important, which means, as Ju said, come together, to find a way of coming together. And I really think that's the great value of the work that we do with the workers' group, because it brings different parts of the family together. So with that, Lucy, just to thank you again on behalf of the ETUC, and to give the floor to yourself for the closing remarks for this session. And you've got the 5 minutes I promised.
Don't worry, Estelle. I will make it. I'm used to. I mean, I would have a lot to say, but in a way, it has been a long day, firstly, and secondly, a lot of extremely clear messages were sent today about the issue. I mean, I hope finally we will get seriously into the industrial policy. As it has not been the case, lack of coordination, lack of genuine European industrial policy, with all the losses Angelova has been referring to, with better coordination and real coordination, we might have much more for the investments we are so much calling for, and go in the same direction. Number one. Number two, seriously talking about reindustrialization, and we need to be also serious about it. In the geopolitical situation we are in, all the crises we have been passing, I mean the two wars, Trump in the US and so on, and the different pressures of the multinationals, not just American ones, but mainly here, we just need to think about how autonomous we should be, in which directions, in which sectors, and how to do it really in a smart way to boost our industry and to help the people. What Jude has been saying on if we get the Green Industrial Deal without the social issues there, for me it means rights, decent jobs, social rights, workers' rights, and so on. We are again losing the chance, and we shouldn't allow this to be happening again and again and again. My second actually point is clearly demonstrated today how important it is to be really joining forces, not just with the ETUC. Estelle, I'm happy that you are here, because definitely with the progressive forces within the parliament, we need to go the same direction. You have been talking about some of the files you are going to be working or are already working on. I mean, Franca is not here anymore, but we just recently adopted a brilliant piece of own initiative opinion on AI and impacts on the world of work. Very important, proposing a number of issues, and cooperation in this respect for me would be the best way how to proceed, because really enormous work has been done already here, and together with you and with the ETUC and other actors on our side, we might push it forward in much faster pace than expected. So for me, the debate we have been having here today is not just a debate. You know that we are going to be continuing in this from the different wider or more narrow aspects. I talked about the productivity issue. We would like to define competitiveness, our view on competitiveness, and our vision and definition we could be able to back up and to push through in all our opinions and in all our actions, which means it's up to us to define what is coming and to be proactive. Because from no to competitiveness, which used to be and still here and there is our position, we need to go yes to competitiveness, important, in this way and shaped like this. That's the proactive approach we need to be coming with, and these are the strategies and the push forward, just confirming our role in the whole process. And our role as trade unions and workers' representatives is today more important than ever before. We should be aware of this, and we should be using it fully for the benefit of working people. Let me thank all the panelists, all the speakers of today, definitely the ETUC for the brilliant cooperation, not just in this, and it's going to be continuing. Esther already mentioned the poor two people just next to us who did have a lot to do, but definitely the whole secretariat on our side, because everybody has actually contributed enormously. So thank you very much, guys, including the technicians and so on. Thank you very much. Of course, I am going to thank the interpreters. Sorry. Sorry. Brilliant job, thanks to the Czech booth. And so basically, I'm closing the conference now. Let me just make two, I would say, internal housekeeping issues I would like to make for the moment for our group. It's the last day of our beloved stagiaire, Alexandra, within our secretariat. Alexandra, you made a brilliant job. Thank you so much for that, and we hope we stay in touch. And the second point for our group is you, hopefully, won't see me for a few weeks from now because I should go through a surgery, and after that I won't be able to fly for 1 or 2 weeks, so it should take some 5 to 6 weeks. Means if everything is okay and I'm fully healthy. If not, you see me much earlier than expected. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the St. Valentine's Day and safe trip back home, and see you soon. Thank you.